Dad, you'll be fine, my daughter said quietly as we sat on a train, heading toward the courthouse where my wife was waiting to end our 30-year marriage. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Then an elderly man suddenly dropped his suitcase in the aisle. Papers scattered everywhere across the floor. I bent down to help him. "Thank you," he said softly. When he learned why we were traveling, he stared at me for a long moment. Then he said something that made no sense at all. "I'm coming with you." An hour later, my wife saw him and instantly turned pale. "Welcome to revenge, Dad." Before we begin, I'd really appreciate if you could drop a quick comment. What are you doing while you listen? Driving, working, or just taking a moment to yourself? I read every comment. Quick note. This story includes some fictionalized details added for narrative impact. What matters most is the message it carries. The divorce papers sat on the cheap hotel desk like a death certificate for a 30-year marriage, and the execution order for everything I had built. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 6:45 on a Monday morning, straightening the tie on my last good suit. The hotel room was small, $280 a night in River North, overlooking the Chicago River in gray November light. 3 weeks ago, I'd been sleeping in my own house. 3 weeks ago, I still ran Pinnacle Hospitality Group, 12 restaurants, 340 employees, 30 years of my life. 3 weeks ago, my wife and the board had voted me out. I picked up the envelope Conrad Stafford had sent. 28 pages of marital settlement agreement in the bloodless language attorneys use when they're taking everything you own. The clause on page 7 was the one that mattered. Upon execution of this agreement, Harlan Riddle agrees to relinquish all rights, interest claims, and operational authority pertaining to Pinnacle Hospitality Group, Inc., in perpetuity. In perpetuity, Latin for forever. I looked at the man in the mirror, 60 years old, hands that still knew how to bone a chicken and negotiate a contract and shake hands with suppliers at 4 a.m. I barely recognized him. Simone thought she could erase 30 years with a paragraph and Conrad's signature. She didn't know about the licensing agreement I'd signed in 1994, handwritten on one page in a windowless office, shaking hands with an old man whose signature just said Gallagher, renewable in perpetuity pending compliance with standards I'd spent 3 decades meeting. If Simone wanted Pinnacle, she'd need that license. And Gallagher Standards hadn't returned her attorney's calls in 6 weeks. How does a man lose everything he built without ever seeing it coming? He trusts the wrong person for 30 years. I folded the divorce papers back into the envelope and set them on the desk. The knock on the door came at 7:15, exactly when I'd expected it. Saskia stood in the hallway, holding 2 takeaway coffees, 28 years old, with my eyes in her mother's cheekbones, and the kind of steady hands you only get from managing crisis without ever letting anyone see you break. She was VP of operations at Pinnacle, or had been, until the board restructured everything and gave her title to someone whose loyalty Simone had purchased with promises. Her eyes were red. She hadn't cried yet. "You're up early," I said. "Couldn't sleep." She handed me one of the coffees, black, no sugar, the way I'd been drinking it since before she was born. "I have something for you. I've been keeping it for 6 months. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to give you false hope before I was sure it would matter." She pulled out a small black USB drive. "What is it?" "Every internal email from Beckett's private server, every wire transfer approval, every directive that went through my desk as branch manager." She pressed it into my palm. "Everything on here is legal chain of custody. I had access rights. I backed it all up." The drive was small, light as air. I held it the way you hold something that might be worthless or might be the only weapon you have left. "How much?" 342 emails spanning March through October. Beckett to Simone, Beckett to the accountant whose name you won't recognize because he doesn't work for Pinnacle. He works for Mercer Capital Partners, Beckett's private fund. Saskia set her coffee down, hands shaking. "They've been moving money, not Pinnacle money directly, but money that should have gone to Pinnacle vendors, rerouting payments, inflating invoices. It's embezzlement with extra steps. You need to understand something about the restaurant business. It's not about the food. It's about the people who show up every single day believing in what you're building. The line cooks who arrive at 4 a.m. The suppliers who extend you credit because they trust your word. When someone steals from a restaurant, they're stealing from everyone who ever believed the work mattered." "Does she know you have this?" "No." Saskia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, quick and angry. And Beckett doesn't know I pulled his server access last month. He thought I wouldn't notice. I noticed everything. I closed my hand around the USB drive. Such a small thing. My daughter had been fighting this war for 6 months while I thought I was standing alone. "The hearing is at 9, she said. "We just have to stop this train before it goes off the cliff." I slipped the drive into my breast pocket next to the envelope Conrad had sent, one document designed to take everything away, one small piece of plastic that might take it back. I buttoned my jacket and looked at my daughter, who had her mother's face and my stubbornness and the kind of loyalty you can't buy or negotiate. "We're not going straight to the courthouse," I said. "We have a train station to reach first." Saskia frowned. "Union Station Zillowud. Because 30 years ago, an old man gave me a handwritten license on faith that I'd build something worth being proud of. I picked up my wallet and room key. And I need to see if he still believes that's true. Neither of us knew yet that the man we were about to meet would be the one holding the real power. Neither of us knew that Simone had already made the mistake that would cost her everything. We just knew we had evidence and a train to catch and a courtroom waiting at 9 o'clock to decide whether 30 years of work could be erased with a signature. I put the divorce papers in my coat pocket and followed my daughter into the hallway toward whatever came next. The train car smelled like coffee and winter coats. Saskia sat beside me in the forward-facing seats, her takeaway cup balanced on her knee, both of us watching the city blur past the windows at 7:45 in the morning. My hand was in my coat pocket, fingers closed around the USB drive she'd given me an hour ago. The divorce papers sat in my other pocket, both documents pulling at me like competing futures. The hearing was at 9. We had time, but not much. I'd chosen the train deliberately. 30 years of driving to meetings, fighting for parking on Wacker, arriving already frayed by the time I walked through whatever door mattered that day. Today I needed to arrive differently, steadier, or at least give myself the chance to try. Saskia hadn't spoken much since we left the hotel. She was doing what she always did before something important, still sorting through whatever she knew, deciding what order things needed to happen in. She'd been doing it since she was 7 years old. That's when I heard it. A heavy thud 2 rows back. Then the soft cascade of papers sliding across the floor of the aisle, shuffling against each other in the way documents do when they've been organized for years and suddenly aren't. I turned. He was 70 if he was a day kneeling in the aisle beside a suitcase that had fallen from the overhead rack. One clasp broken open, scattering file folders and tax documents across the floor, while the other passengers shifted their legs or looked away or studied their phones with the focused attention of people who have decided not to see something. "Dad," Saskia touched my arm. "We'll be late. The courthouse is across town." I know. I stood anyway. I don't know why. Maybe because I'd spent 30 years building restaurants on the principle that you notice people, that everyone matters, whether they're wearing a suit or an apron or struggling with luggage they can't carry. Maybe because in a few hours I'd be signing papers that said none of that mattered, that the only thing that counted was who controlled the money. I moved down the aisle and bent down beside him, gathering the scattered papers, tax documents, business licenses, certification renewals, the kind of paperwork that accumulates when you've been running something long enough that the filing cabinets start to multiply. The old man looked up at me with eyes that seemed sharper than the cataracts at their edges suggested. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." I gathered the last of the documents and slid them back into the suitcase, pressing the broken clasp closed as best I could. "But I'm doing it anyway." He accepted my hand to stand careful, deliberate, the careful rise of someone who'd learned to respect gravity. Once upright, he steadied himself against the seat back, breathing like he'd climbed stairs instead of risen from a train floor. "Thank you," he said. "Most people just walk past." How many people walk past someone who needs help because they're late to something important? How many times had I done it myself before today too, focused on the next meeting or the next crisis, to notice the person struggling right in front of me? "Where are you headed?" I asked. He looked at me with those sharp eyes and I realized I'd misjudged him. The frailty was real, the tremor in his hands, the careful way he moved, but there was something underneath it that didn't match. Something that suggested he'd been watching the world long enough to know exactly how it worked. "Courtney," he said. "Same as you, I expect." I must have shown surprise because he smiled thin and knowing. Man in a good suit at 7:45 in the morning, carrying himself like he's about to lose something important. "You're not going to the office." He gestured at the suitcase. "I've been traveling. Been in Chicago for a few weeks now. Palm Beach shipping luggage up is never simple, didn't expect it to feel quite so heavy at 70. Saskia had appeared at my shoulder. Her voice had changed, less impatient, more careful. What kind of court? Civil, licensing dispute. He looked at me. What about you? Divorce, I said. The word still felt strange. My wife and her attorney are trying to take the company I built. I'm heading to Cook County to fight it. What kind of company? Restaurants, Pinnacle Hospitality Group. 12 locations across Chicago. Something shifted in his expression. The frailty fell away for just a second, like a curtain pulled back. Which firm handles the licensing for your restaurants? His voice was suddenly steadier, more focused. You need to understand what a licensing agreement means in the restaurant business. It's not just permission to use a name. It's the foundation everything else is built on. Health codes, safety certifications, supplier standards, all of it flows from that original license. Without it, you're not a restaurant. You're just a building with ovens. Gallagher Culinary Standards, I said. The original agreement from 1994, handwritten one page signed by someone who just wrote Gallagher at the bottom. The old man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card, plain white stock with raised black lettering. He handed it to me. Otis Gallagher, founder, and Director Gallagher Culinary Standards. A phone number, nothing else. I looked at the card, then at the old man, 70 years old, with paper-thin skin and hands that shook when he wasn't thinking about it, but eyes that had been sharp enough to recognize something in my face or my story that I hadn't said out loud. The train was slowing. Through the window, Union Station's platforms were sliding into view, the morning light cutting through the gaps between structures in long, parallel lines. Young man, Otis Gallagher said, I need to be in that courtroom today, and I believe you need me there more than you know. Why? Because 30 years ago, I signed a licensing agreement with a kid who promised me he'd build something worth being proud of. And I've been getting calls from an attorney named Conrad Stafford for 6 weeks asking about transferring that license to your wife. He picked up the suitcase. I didn't return his calls. I wanted to see for myself what kind of man you'd become. Saskia was watching him with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not surprised she'd gone very still the way she did when she was thinking 3 moves ahead. Something that looked almost like relief. Saskia, I said. We should go, she said quietly. All 3 of us. The courthouse is 20 minutes away, and we don't want to be late. The train doors opened. The platform smell, cold concrete and diesel replaced the warmth of the car. I carried the heavier of Otis's 2 suitcases off the train and across the platform through the concourse and out onto Canal Street, where the morning traffic was already dense. I'll get a cab, I said. The taxi had barely pulled onto Canal Street when Otis asked me to tell him about Pinnacle, not the polite curiosity of a stranger, but the precise tone of someone confirming what they already knew. Saskia sat in the front seat quiet, watching the city slide past through rain-streaked windows. That expression from Union Station relief, or recognition, or something older than both, had settled into her face like she'd been holding a secret so long it had become part of her features. There's not much to tell, I said. I opened the first location in 1994 with $200,000 in savings. River North, 48 seats, a menu I'd spent 3 years developing. I met the founder of Gallagher Culinary Standards at a Chicago culinary conference 6 months before opening. He was older then, even older now if he's still alive. We sat at a corner table and talked for 2 hours about what standards meant about building something that would last. Otis was watching me the way judges watch witnesses, not for what they say, but for what they're trying not to say. "Oh, the licensing agreement," he asked. Handwritten, 1 page. He had a silver-handled cane and hands that shook when he wrote, but the signature was steady. Gallagher. Just that, nothing else. I looked out the window at Michigan Avenue, sliding past all the buildings I'd looked at every morning for 30 years. He shook my hand and told me to honor the promise I'd made. I've spent 3 decades trying to do exactly that. Otis closed his eyes for exactly 1 deliberate second. Not exhaustion, not age, something more intentional. When he opened them again, they were the same sharp gray they'd been at Union Station, but now I understood what I was seeing. Recognition. Memory. The look of someone who just heard his own words come back to him across 30 years. Saskia said nothing, but I caught her watching Otis in the rearview mirror with that same expression from the station relief mixed with something I couldn't name. Something that suggested she'd known who we were meeting all along. 12 locations now, Otis asked. 12, 340 employees, 85 million in valuation as of the last audit. The numbers felt hollow, saying them out loud like reciting someone else's accomplishments. My wife thinks she can sign a divorce agreement and walk away with half. Her attorney thinks he can transfer the licensing to her name without anyone noticing. And you think, you have to understand what a handshake meant in 1994, before lawyers turned everything into 40-page contracts, before every promise needed insurance. A handshake from the right person could build an empire. That's what Otis had given me 30 years ago. That's what Simone thought she could take with Conrad's signature. I think, I said slowly, that some things can't be transferred with paperwork, that the license has my name on it for a reason. Otis smiled, thin and knowing. The license has your name on it because you earned it, every day for 30 years. The taxi pulled up to the Daily Center at 8:50. We had 10 minutes before the hearing. Saskia paid the driver while I helped Otis with his luggage lighter, now, or maybe I was just more prepared for the wait. The 8th floor hallway stretched ahead of us like a stage, and Simone stood at its center. 55 years old and flawless in a red Burberry coat that probably cost more than my hotel room for the month. Perfect hair, perfect makeups, the kind of smile that belonged on magazine covers or campaign posters. She stood there like she was posing for a photographer who hadn't arrived yet, radiating the confidence of someone who'd already won and was just waiting for everyone else to acknowledge it. Conrad Stafford stood beside her like a legal bodyguard, 48 polished expensive suit that fit too well to be anything but custom. He had the posture of someone who'd never lost a case and didn't expect to start today. Beckett stood on Simone's other side, 38, in a new Rolex that caught the fluorescent light. My daughter's husband checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be than the dissolution of the empire that had paid for that watch. I had walked down this same hallway hundreds of times over 3 decades to sign supplier contracts, to negotiate leases, to shake hands with investors who believed in what we were building. Never to lose everything I'd built. Never with my wife waiting at the end like an execution. Simone saw me first. The smile sharpened, became more controlled, more deliberate. She said something to Conrad without taking her eyes off me, and he straightened slightly, ready. Then she saw Otis. I watched it happen from 30 feet away, watched the color leave her face so fast, it looked like someone had pulled a plug. Her smile didn't fade, it froze, crystallized, shattered into something that wasn't a smile anymore, but couldn't quite become fear, because there were too many people watching. She grabbed Conrad's sleeve. Not a gentle touch, not a whispered aside. She grabbed him hard enough that his whole arm moved, her fingers visibly shaking even from where I stood. Conrad turned surprised, and Simone leaned in close. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see her lips moving fast, urgent, the kind of panic that doesn't care about appearances anymore. Beckett noticed. He looked at Simone, then followed her gaze down the hallway to where Otis stood beside me, with his cane and his quiet 70-year-old face that somehow commanded the entire hallway without saying a word. Conrad leaned down and whispered something to Simone, reassurance I assumed, or strategy. Whatever he said didn't work. Her fingers stayed clenched on his sleeve, her face stayed pale, and her eyes stayed locked on Otis, with the expression of someone who had just watched their entire plan collapse. She knew something I didn't know yet. She knew exactly who Otis Gallagher was, exactly what power he held over Pinnacle's existence, and exactly how much trouble she was in now that he was standing in this courthouse hallway with his hand on my shoulder. The courtroom doors would open in 15 minutes. I had a feeling those would be the longest 15 minutes of Simone's life. The gavel came down at 9:30 exactly, and Judge Harriet Lancaster looked down at the courtroom with the flat expression of someone who had presided over 300 divorce cases and expected to be disappointed by 301. Simone had recovered her composure by the time we sat down, the panic from the hallway buried under fresh powder, and a smile that belonged in a courtroom the way ice belongs in July. She sat at the plaintiff's table, with Conrad beside her, Beckett 1 row back, all 3 of them arranged like a photograph of people who had already won. I sat at the defense table with Celeste Redmond on my right, 52-years-old gray suit, the kind of calm that comes from winning cases other lawyers won't touch. She'd barely spoken to me since we met an hour ago, outside the courtroom, just handed me a legal pad and told me to write down anything Conrad said that was a lie. The pad was still blank. Otis sat in the gallery behind me. I could feel his presence the way you feel, weather-changing, quiet, patient, inevitable. Judge Lancaster, 62, with sharp eyes and sharper patience, looked at Conrad. "Mr. Stafford, you may proceed." Conrad stood with the smooth confidence of a man who had never lost. His voice filled the courtroom like he was addressing a jury of hundreds instead of one judge who looked like she'd heard it all before. "Your Honor, my client has endured years of emotional abandonment while dedicating herself to building Pinnacle Hospitality Group from concept to reality. What began as her husband's small restaurant in 1994 became, through her vision and leadership, a 12-location enterprise valued at $85 million. I felt Celeste's hand touch my arm, light brief a reminder to stay quiet. Conrad pulled a manila folder from his briefcase with the theatrical precision of someone revealing evidence in a murder trial. "Unfortunately, Your Honor, while Mrs. Riddle was building this empire, her husband was engaged in extramarital affairs that constitute clear grounds for fault divorce under Illinois statute." The lie was so clean it almost sounded true. "We have sworn testimony from Roland Hayes, a hospitality industry colleague who attended the Chicago Restaurant Association conference on March 14, 2024, at the Four Seasons Hotel. Mr. Hayes has provided a detailed statement, placing Mr. Riddle in the company of a woman who was definitively not his wife." Conrad pulled out an 8x10 photograph, held it up for the judge. "Photographic evidence corroborates this testimony, Mr. Riddle entering a hotel suite at 11:47 p.m. with the individual in question. I'd never been to the Four Seasons on March 14th. I'd never met anyone named Roland Hayes, but the photograph Conrad was showing Judge Lancaster looked real enough from where I sat. A man's profile that could have been mine, a timestamp in the corner, a hotel corridor that could have been anywhere. They'd planned this. Not for weeks, for months. Every detail calculated, every lie documented, every piece of evidence manufactured with the kind of precision that requires time and money, and the absolute certainty that no one will check too carefully. Under the Illinois Marriage and Dissolution of Marriage Act, specifically, Section 750I, L, C, S, 5/503. Dissipation of marital assets is a recognized factor in equitable distribution. Mr. Riddle's extramarital conduct directly caused the dissipation of marital funds. More critically, Your Honor, the marital settlement agreement signed by both parties in May 2023 included a specific fidelity clause. Breach of that clause constitutes material violation of the agreement and entitles Mrs. Riddle to enhanced asset distribution as specified in the agreement's remedies section. Listen to a divorce lawyer long enough, and you learn to hear what they're not saying. Conrad wasn't arguing that I'd cheated. He was arguing that Simone deserved everything because she'd tolerated it. The narrative was perfect successful wife, philandering husband, decades of building something only to have it undermined by betrayal. Judge Lancaster had probably heard that story 50 times this year alone. "We are therefore requesting," Conrad continued, "that this court rule Mr. Riddle in breach of the marital settlement agreement and order him to relinquish all rights, interests, and operational authority pertaining to Pinnacle Hospitality Group effective immediately." He let that hang in the air for exactly 3 seconds, a practiced silence. "Furthermore, we request the court award Mrs. Riddle sole ownership and control of all business assets, vendor contracts, intellectual property, and most critically all licensing agreements currently held under Mr. Riddle's name." There it was, the licensing agreement. The one thing Simone actually needed wrapped in enough legal theater that it looked like just another line item in a property settlement. 30 years of marriage, and the lie Simone chose to destroy it with was adultery. The one thing I'd never done, the one promise I'd never broken. Not because I was particularly noble, but because I'd watched my own father lose everything to that particular kind of betrayal when I was 12. I'd promised myself then that I'd never become him. And now Simone was using that promise against me, turning my one clean thing into the weapon that would take everything else. Conrad couldn't use adultery as divorce grounds. Illinois had moved past that years ago. But he could use it to argue dissipation of marital assets to paint me as someone who'd squandered what Simone built to justify giving her everything under the banner of equitable distribution. Celeste sat beside me, taking notes with a silver pen, her face completely neutral. She hadn't objected once, hadn't challenged a single statement, just wrote in neat shorthand on her legal pad while Conrad spun his story. Her composure was the only thing keeping me in my seat. Judge Lancaster looked down at the folder Conrad had placed on her bench. "Is that all, Mr. Stafford?" "Yes, Your Honor. We believe the evidence speaks clearly to Mr. Riddle's breach and Mrs. Riddle's rightful claim to the marital assets she built." Conrad placed the folder on Judge Lancaster's bench with the careful precision of someone laying down a winning hand in poker. Then he turned and smiled at me across the center aisle. Not a polite professional smile, but the expression of a man who had just delivered a knockout punch and was waiting for me to fall. He didn't know the game hadn't started yet. He didn't know about the USB drive in my jacket pocket with 342 emails. He didn't know who Otis Gallagher was, or why his presence in this courtroom had drained the color from Simone's face 30 minutes ago. And he definitely didn't know that Celeste Redmond's silence wasn't surrender, it was patience. Celeste Redmond stood up, carrying nothing but a single piece of paper. No briefcase, no thick folder, no stack of evidence. And the simplicity of it made Conrad's confident smile falter for just a second. She walked to Judge Lancaster's bench with the unhurried calm of someone who had already won the argument in her mind and was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. The paper she placed on the bench looked old, the edges slightly yellowed, the text dense and handwritten. "Your Honor." Celeste said, her voice carrying the same measured tone she'd maintained through Conrad's entire presentation. "Before we address Mr. Stafford's allegations, my client requests the court take judicial notice of a licensing agreement central to the accurate valuation of all marital assets in this proceeding." Conrad stood. "Relevance, Your Honor. This has no bearing on the divorce settlement." Judge Lancaster picked up the document, looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, then looked at Celeste. "Counselor, it determines asset value," Celeste said. 4 words. Conrad's objection died in his throat. The licensing agreement wasn't just paperwork. It was the foundation Pinnacle was built on. Without it, the restaurants were just buildings with ovens. Without Gallagher Culinary Standards, certification, every supplier contract, every insurance policy, every health inspection meant nothing. Conrad had spent 40 minutes arguing about who deserved to own an empire, and Celeste had just reminded the court that the empire didn't exist without permission from someone who wasn't in the room. Except he was in the room. I turned slightly and saw Otis sitting in the gallery, sitting upright with both hands on the cane he'd carried since I first met him, watching Conrad with the kind of chilling calm that comes from holding all the power and knowing you haven't used it yet. Simone saw him too. I watched her face, the careful makeup, the practiced composure, and saw the moment she understood what was happening. Her eyes went to Otis, then to the document on Judge Lancaster's bench, then back to Conrad, with an expression that wasn't quite panic, but was getting close. Judge Lancaster looked up from the agreement. "Mr. Stafford, your client is claiming sole ownership of Pinnacle Hospitality Group based on her operational contributions, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you're requesting transfer of all business assets, including licensing agreements." "That's correct." "Then Ms. Redmond's point is well taken. If the licensing agreement is non-transferable or contingent on specific ownership, it affects the value of what you're fighting over." She set the document down. "Objection overruled. The licensing agreement is admitted as relevant to asset valuation." Celeste nodded once. "Thank you, Your Honor. We request a brief recess to prepare our response to Mr. Stafford's allegations." 20 minutes, Judge Lancaster said, and brought the gavel down. "You need to understand what a licensing agreement means when your entire brand is built on someone else's foundation. Without Gallagher Culinary Standards, Pinnacle wasn't worth $85 million. It wasn't worth $85,000. It was 12 buildings with commercial kitchens and a name that meant nothing without the certification that made suppliers trust us, that made investors believe in us, that made customers walk through our doors knowing the food would be exactly what we promised." Conrad had just spent an hour arguing over the division of an asset he didn't understand, couldn't be divided. We stood in the 8th floor hallway, me, Saskia, and Otis, while Celeste disappeared into a conference room with her notes. The hallway was quiet, just the distant hum of the building and the occasional footstep from someone passing. Otis set his briefcase on the wooden bench between us and opened it with the careful movements of someone who'd been carrying important documents for longer than most people had been alive. He pulled out a manila folder yellowed at the edges and opened it to reveal the original licensing agreement from 1994, the one I'd signed in a windowless office that smelled like coffee shaking hands with a man whose signature just said Gallagher. Page 47. Otis said, turning the document, Section 12, Clause 4. I read the handwritten text. License shall be immediately revocable upon 30 days written notice if licensee engages in conduct materially inconsistent with the Gallagher standard of business integrity, including, but not limited to, misrepresentation, to investors' breach of fiduciary duty, or fraudulent financial practices. I'd read that clause in 1994 and thought it was standard legal language. Now, it read like a loaded gun. I signed this with you 30 years ago. Otis said, because you asked me what I believe food should do for people, not how much money it could make, not how fast we could expand. You asked about people. He closed the folder. When your daughter called me 3 weeks ago, I was already packed. I looked at Saskia. Her eyes were red. You called him. I had spent 3 weeks thinking I was alone, that I'd lost everything, because I'd been too trusting, too focused on building something instead of protecting it. I hadn't lost anything. I'd raised a daughter who knew how to fight before I even knew there was a war. I didn't tell you, Daddy, she said quietly, because I needed to know if he would actually come before I gave you something to hope for. I have been watching Pinnacle for 22 years, Otis said. Not closely, I trusted you, but I watch all my licensees. When Saskia called and told me what was happening, I already had concerns about certain financial irregularities I'd noticed in your public filings. Nothing I could prove, but enough to make me wonder. The USB drive, I said. Saskia nodded. The emails go back 6 months. Beckett routing payments, Simone signing off on vendor contracts that didn't exist, money disappearing into accounts that shouldn't have access. I didn't have enough to prove fraud, but I had enough to show someone who knew what to look for. Otis tapped the Section 12 clause with one finger. 30 days written notice. If this court determines your wife engaged in the conduct described here, I can revoke the license and reassign it to you, because you're the one who earned it. The hallway was quiet except for the sound of Otis closing his briefcase, barely louder than a breath, but in that silence it landed like the closing of a vault. Saskia put her hand on mine, gently, without saying anything. We had 12 minutes before Judge Lancaster returned to the bench, and I finally understood what Celeste had been preparing for all along. Not to defend against Conrad's lies about adultery, to prove Simone had violated the one contract that made Pinnacle worth fighting over in the first place. The bailiff knocked twice and the courtroom doors opened, but the air that rushed back in felt different than it had before. The recess heavier charged with the electricity that comes before lightning strikes. I understood now what Celeste had been preparing for, not to defend against Conrad's fabricated adultery claims, but to prove that Simone had spent 6 years systematically erasing the foundation Pinnacle was built on. To show that while Conrad was manufacturing evidence of affairs that never happened, Simone had been committing a different kind of fraud, the kind that destroyed not just marriages, but investor confidence, SEC compliance, and the legal integrity of everything we'd built. Judge Lancaster took the bench. Ms. Redmond, you may proceed. Celeste stood with the same measured calm she'd shown all morning. But now there was something else underneath it. Not anger, not satisfaction, just the absolute certainty of someone who had built an unassailable case and was about to prove it. She placed a stack of documents on Judge Lancaster's bench. Not the single page from before the recess. This was thicker, organized with colored tabs. Your Honor, we now address the pattern of material misrepresentation my opposing counsel's client has engaged in for the past 6 years regarding the origin and ownership of Pinnacle Hospitality Group. Simone's face stayed perfectly composed, but I'd been married to her for 30 years. I knew what that particular kind of stillness meant. She was calculating how bad this was going to get. These are copies of 23 published articles from 2018 through 2024. Celeste continued, appearing in Chicago, Tribune, Crane's Chicago Business and Restaurant magazine, among others. All feature interviews with Mrs. Riddle. All quote her claiming she built Pinnacle Hospitality Group from scratch, or founded the restaurant empire through personal vision and determination. Celeste pulled out one article, held it up. Chicago Tribune, March 2020. Simone Riddle, the visionary founder of Pinnacle Hospitality Group, discusses building her empire from a single storefront to 12 locations. Not one word about the licensing agreement that made the brand legally possible. Not one mention of Gallagher culinary standards. She set it down, pulled out another. Crane's Business, August 2022. self-made restaurateur Simone Riddle on creating Chicago's premier dining experience from the ground up. Again, no acknowledgement of the foundation license, the agreement that actually determines whether Pinnacle can exist. Conrad stood. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. Overruled, Judge Lancaster said, without looking up from the documents. Celeste continued as if Conrad hadn't spoken. In addition to the 23 articles, we have 4 investor presentation decks spanning 2019 to 2024, all prepared and presented by Mrs. Riddle to potential partners and financial backers. Every single deck presents the Pinnacle origin story as Mrs. Riddle's solo venture. Every single deck values the company based on brand reputation, without disclosing that the brand itself is contingent on a licensing agreement she doesn't control. You have to understand what it means to watch someone erase you from your own story, not just taking credit for your work, but rewriting history so completely that investors, reporters, and eventually the whole city believes a version of reality where you never existed, where the 30 years you spent building something, the relationships you cultivated, the standards you maintained, all of it gets compressed into someone else's narrative about their vision and determination. Your Honor, Celeste said, her voice steady, this is material misrepresentation to investors, under Securities and Exchange Commission regulations, specifically Rule 10b-5. Making false or misleading statements in connection with the purchase or sale of securities constitutes fraud. Mrs. Riddle has been presenting Pinnacle's value to potential investors while systematically concealing the fact that the company's operational license is held by a third party and is subject to revocation. Conrad was on his feet again. Objection, hearsay. These are journalist interpretations, not overruled. These are published statements attributed directly to your client, Mr. Stafford. I watched Simone beneath the table, the same tension in her shoulders I'd learned to read over 30 years, the stillness of a woman calculating damage control. When the contractor found the kitchen remodel she'd authorized without telling me, when the accountant asked about the personal expenses she'd run through the business account, that particular tension in her fingers that meant she was already 3 steps ahead, calculating how to minimize damage. Celeste placed the final investor deck on the bench. This presentation, dated January 2024, values Pinnacle Hospitality Group at $91 million based on brand strength, customer loyalty, and operational excellence. It projects 5-year growth, assuming continued licensing and certification standards, but doesn't disclose that those standards are maintained by an external authority that can revoke permission at any time. Conrad stood a third time. Objection, Your Honor, prejudicial. Ms. Redmond is destined to combat minor. Overruled. Your Honor, this is speculative. Mr. Stafford, I've ruled. Sit down. Conrad was a lawyer who had built his entire career on never showing weakness, but objecting 4 times to the same set of documents was the legal equivalent of a drowning man breaking the surface to gasp for air. Each objection was a tell-not-legal strategy, but panic. Mrs. Riddle has spent 6 years, Celeste continued, telling investors, reporters, and this court that she built Pinnacle alone. That narrative isn't just inaccurate, it's fraudulent misrepresentation that inflates asset value and conceals material risk. And under the ethics clause my client signed with Gallagher Culinary Standards in 1994, this pattern of misrepresentation may constitute grounds for license revocation. Conrad shot to his feet. Objection. Overruled, Judge Lancaster said, and this time there was an edge in her voice. Mr. Stafford, you've objected 4 times in 5 minutes. Unless you have something substantive beyond repeated objections, I suggest you let Ms. Redmond finish. I watched the certainty drain from Conrad's posture, the way water drains from a cracked basin, slowly at first, then all at once. He sat down without asking permission, and for the first time that morning, Simone looked at him, not with confidence, but with something closer to fear. Celeste Redmond was just getting started, and Conrad knew it. Conrad stood up again, and for a moment he looked like a man who had regained control, but the way his hand gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table told a different story entirely. He'd just been overruled 4 times. His client was sitting at her table with arms crossed, shoulders rigid, and a face that had gone from confident to calculating. But Conrad was a lawyer who had built a career on never admitting defeat, and he was going to sell the adultery story harder this time, because it was the only weapon he had left. Your Honor. He said, his voice carrying the deliberate emphasis of someone trying to regain authority. I'd like to return to the matter of Mr. Riddle's documented infidelity, which forms the legal basis for Mrs. Riddle's claim under Illinois equitable distribution provisions and the fidelity clause of the marital settlement agreement. He placed the photographs on Judge Lancaster's bench again this time, with more deliberate ceremony, the 8x10 images of a man who might have been me entering a hotel corridor that could have been anywhere. Photographic evidence placing Mr. Riddle at the Four Seasons Hotel on the evening of March 14th, 2024, with a woman who was definitively not his wife. Conrad picked up a document from his table. We have sworn testimony from Roland Hayes, a respected colleague in the hospitality industry, who personally witnessed Mr. Riddle in the company of this individual. I watched him perform. The gestures were bigger now, the voice louder, every word emphasized like he was trying to convince himself as much as the judge. You learn to read a courtroom the same way you read a dining room when a lawyer starts talking louder, gesturing bigger, emphasizing every word. It means they're trying to sell you something they know doesn't taste right. Conrad was selling hard. Under Section 750, ILC S5/503 of the Illinois Marriage and Dissolution of Marriage Act, dissipation of marital assets is a recognized factor in equitable distribution. Under the marital settlement agreement signed by both parties in May 2023, violation of the fidelity clause constitutes material breach entitling Mrs. Riddle to seek enhanced asset distribution as specified in the agreement's remedies section. He turned to face me directly. Mr. Riddle violated both the legal contract and the marriage contract. Mrs. Riddle is therefore entitled to sole ownership of all marital assets, including Pinnacle Hospitality Group. That's when I saw it, a small movement from the back of the courtroom. Beckett Mercer, sitting in the last row, nodded once at Conrad. Not obvious, not theatrical. Just a brief tilt of the head that said, "Message received," or "Well done," or "Keep going." A signal between conspirators. I filed it away without reacting. Celeste had seen it too. I caught the slight pause in her pen movement, the way her eyes tracked to Beckett and back to her notes without her expression changing. Conrad sat down looking satisfied. He'd made his case, presented his evidence, invoked the statutes. In his mind, he'd just recovered from the licensing agreement disaster by refocusing the judge on what he thought was his strongest weapon. Celeste Redmond stood up. Your Honor, regarding Mr. Stafford's photographic evidence and witness testimony, I'd like to present 3 items for the court's consideration. She placed a single sheet of paper on Judge Lancaster's bench. First, EXIF metadata analysis of the photograph Mr. Stafford submitted. EXIF data is digital information embedded in every photograph, including creation, date, camera, type, and editing history. Judge Lancaster picked up the page. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in the way she was holding herself. This analysis shows the photograph was created in Adobe Photoshop on November 2nd, 2023. The base image, the hotel corridor, was originally taken in May 2019. The composite figure was added 8 months before the date Mr. Stafford claims this photograph depicts. The EXIF data didn't just prove the photo was fake. It proved Conrad had commissioned it 8 months before the divorce filing, meaning this wasn't opportunistic. It was premeditated. Celeste continued without pausing. Second, regarding witness Roland Hayes. Mr. Hayes is employed by Keller and Associates, a consulting firm that has shared office space and cross-referred clients with Mr. Stafford's practice for 3 years. This conflict of interest was never disclosed to this court or to my client. I watched Conrad's face. The confident performance was draining away, replaced by something harder to name. Not quite fear. Lawyers like Conrad didn't do fear in public, but recognition. The understanding that his weapon had just turned into evidence against him. The third, my client has a complete alibi for the evening of March 14th, 2024. 6 business partners can testify he was dining with them at Pinnacle's River North location from 7:30 p.m. to 11:45 p.m. We have credit card receipts, timestamped security footage from the restaurant, and valet records showing his car never left the premises. Celeste set another document on the bench. Mr. Stafford didn't just present misleading evidence, Your Honor. He presented fabricated evidence, a photoshopped composite created 8 months in advance, supported by testimony from a witness with undisclosed financial ties to his own practice describing events that provably did not occur. Judge Lancaster looked at Conrad through her reading glasses. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Mr. Stafford. She said, her voice very calm, very measured. Are you aware that submitting fabricated photographic evidence to this court may constitute forgery under 720 ILCS 5/17-3, and that inducing a witness to provide false sworn testimony constitutes subornation of perjury under 720 ILCS 5/32-3? Conrad's hands, which had been gesturing confidently throughout his presentation, went completely still. In a courtroom, a lawyer's hands tell you more than their words. Moving hands mean confidence, certainty, control. Still hands mean a man who has just realized he's made a mistake he can't talk his way out of, and hasn't admitted it to himself yet. Your Honor, Conrad started. I'm not asking for an explanation at this moment, Mr. Stafford. I'm asking if you understand that what you've presented may constitute a criminal act. Yes, Your Honor. Then I suggest you take the next recess to consider very carefully whether you wish to continue representing Mrs. Riddle in this matter. Judge Lancaster was still looking at him, waiting for something, an apology, an explanation, anything that might suggest this had been a mistake rather than a strategy. But Conrad just stood there with his hands flat on the table, and I realized he didn't have an explanation that wouldn't make things worse. He wasn't the only one who had been caught fabricating. Simone was staring at him from the plaintiff's table, and Beckett had gone very still in the back row, and I knew with absolute certainty that all three of them were calculating how much trouble they were in, and whether there was any way out that didn't involve turning on each other. Judge Lancaster called a 15-minute recess, and before I could stand up, Beckett Mercer was moving, grabbing Simone's arm and pulling her toward the small waiting room beside the courtroom, with the urgency of a man whose secrets were about to catch fire. They didn't see Saskia following them, or if they did, they were too focused on their own crisis to care that my daughter was positioning herself against the hallway wall near the waiting room door. The door didn't close completely, left ajar by maybe a quarter-inch enough that sound carried if you knew how to listen. Saskia had her phone in her hand screen dark recording. I stayed at the defense table watching through the open courtroom door. Celeste was beside me, organizing documents, but her eyes tracked to Saskia with the same careful attention I was giving the scene. Beckett's voice came through the gap, low and frantic. Simone, the Delaware account. If they pull full financial records, it's going to show transfers I made that you don't know about. We need to settle this, today, right now. Take whatever they offer, and let's get out of here before... What transfers? Simone's voice was sharp, cutting through whatever Beckett had been about to say. Beckett, what did you do? I needed operating capital. The fund wasn't generating returns fast enough, and I had investors asking questions. So I moved some money from Pinnacle's accounts into the LLC, just temporarily, just to cover the how much... Silence. The kind that means the number is worse than expected. How much, Beckett? At $4.2 million over the last 18 months. 30 years running, restaurants taught me that when someone gets desperate in a negotiation, they make mistakes. They talk too much. They reveal things they meant to keep hidden. They assume the person they're talking to is the only threat in the room. Beckett had just made all three mistakes at once. He thought Simone was the only person who mattered in this conversation. He'd forgotten about the door that didn't quite close. He'd forgotten about my daughter standing in the hallway with a phone that recorded everything. You stole $4 million from my company. Simone's voice had gone very quiet, which was worse than if she'd shouted. Our company, and I was going to pay it back. I just needed time to... We're leaving, right now. We're going to tell Conrad to settle for whatever they're offering, and we're leaving this courthouse before Celeste Redmond figures out what you did. She already knows, Beckett said. Look at her. She's been sitting there all morning like someone who's already won. They know Simone, all of it. The waiting room door opened, and Simone walked out first, her face composed but her eyes calculating. Beckett followed 2 steps behind, looking like a man who'd just realized the walls were closing in and there was nowhere left to run. Saskia waited until they had passed, until the hallway was clear, then walked over to where I was still standing at the defense table. She handed me her phone without explanation. You'll understand what this is when the time comes, she said quietly. I took the phone. The recording was still running 17 minutes and 43 seconds of Beckett Mercer confessing to embezzling over $4 million from the company his mother-in-law was trying to steal from me. The bailiff knocked on the courtroom door. 5 minutes, counsel. Celeste looked at the phone in my hand, then at Saskia, then back at her documents. She didn't ask what was on the recording. She didn't need to. The small smile that touched the corner of her mouth told me she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Court resumed at 11:40. Judge Lancaster took the bench and looked at Celeste. "Ms. Redmond, do you have additional evidence to present?" "Yes, Your Honor." Celeste stood with the same measured calm she'd shown all morning, but now there was an edge underneath it. Not anger, something colder. "I'd like to address financial irregularities that have come to light regarding Beckett Mercer's role as Chief Financial Officer of Pinnacle Hospitality Group." Beckett went very still in his seat. Celeste placed a stack of documents on Judge Lancaster's bench. Bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, registration records from the Delaware Secretary of State. Mr. Mercer established a Delaware limited liability company called Mercer Capital Partners in March 2023. Over the subsequent 18 months, he systematically transferred $4.2 million from Pinnacle's operating account into this LLC. Watching Beckett's scheme unravel was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. You could see each support beam fail, hear each connection snap, and the only question left was how much debris would be left when it finally hit the ground. These transfers were not disclosed to the board, not reported in Pinnacle's financial statements, and not authorized by any party other than Mr. Mercer himself. Celeste turned a page. "This is self-dealing that violates the CFO's fiduciary duty under the Illinois Business Corporation Act. More critically, Your Honor, this constitutes Class 10, felony theft under 720 ILCS 5/NESCA 16-1 B 6.3, which applies to amounts exceeding $1 million, the most serious theft classification under Illinois law, carrying a mandatory sentence of 6 to 30 years. Judge Lancaster looked directly at Beckett. "Mr. Mercer, are you currently represented by counsel in this proceeding?" Beckett stood, his face pale. "I know, Your Honor. I'm here as—" "I'm not asking why you're here, Mr. Mercer. I'm asking if you have an attorney." "No, Your Honor." "Then I strongly advise you to retain counsel before this session concludes. Criminal counsel, specifically." She looked at the documents. "Ms. Redmond, I assume you're prepared to provide copies of this evidence to the state's attorney." "Yes, Your Honor. We've already prepared a referral package." Beckett looked at Simone with desperation, the look of someone who thought they'd had an ally and was just now realizing they'd been working with another predator the entire time. Simone looked back at him with something colder than anger. Recognition. The understanding that while she'd been planning to take Pinnacle from me, Beckett had been planning to take it from both of us. That the man she'd brought into the family, the CFO, she'd trusted with the company, finances had been running his own parallel scheme the entire time. Beckett looked at Simone. Simone looked at Beckett. 30 years of my marriage compressed into that one silent exchange across a courtroom floor, the moment when two people realize they've been using each other the entire time, and the person they thought was their accomplice was actually just another predator. She had invited the wolf in. The wolf had been eating them both, and now the wolf had nowhere left to run. The hallway outside courtroom 812 smelled like floor wax and fear. I watched Simone reach for Conrad's arm, the same gesture she'd used on me 1,000 times when she needed reassurance, and I watched him step just far enough away that her fingers closed on air. The wolf had been caught. Now the wolf was watching her allies decide whether to stay in the trap or save themselves. Simone tried again, gripping Conrad's sleeve with enough force that I could see the fabric bunch. She leaned in close, her voice pitched high and tight with panic. Something about settling. Something about today. Something about getting out before it got worse. Conrad's face stayed professional, but his eyes told a different story. They weren't looking at Simone. They were looking past her, calculating exit strategies, measuring distances between himself and the wreckage. I recognized that look. Beckett had worn it 30 minutes ago when Judge Lancaster advised him to retain criminal counsel. Conrad reached down and physically removed Simone's hand from his sleeve. Not roughly just lifted her fingers away with the detached courtesy of someone declining an offer they'd already refused. Then he stepped back, putting another 6 inches of hallway between them. Simone stood there with her hand still half raised, and for the first time all day she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had just realized her attorney was abandoning her. Beckett stood 10 feet down the hallway, watching his mother-in-law unravel and saying nothing. He'd already made his calculations. How many times had I watched Simone weaponized touch a hand on an investor's forearm during a pitch, fingers trailing across a maitre d's shoulder when she wanted the best table? 30 years of strategic contact, and now her own attorney was stepping out of reach like she carried contagion. Celeste appeared at my elbow. "Otis is ready. This ends in 15 minutes. The bailiff opened the courtroom door. "Court is reconvening." Simone looked back at Conrad. He was already walking toward the courtroom, not waiting, not offering his arm. She walked in alone. Judge Lancaster took the bench at 12:15. "Ms. Redmond, call your next witness." The defense calls Otis Gallagher. Otis walked to the witness stand, one hand resting on his cane. The bailiff swore him in. He stated his name and age, then sat down with the careful movements of someone who'd been carrying important knowledge for decades. "Mr. Gallagher," Celeste said, "please tell the court your occupation." "I am the founder and current director of Gallagher Culinary Standards, a private licensing authority established in 1992. Simone's head snapped up. Conrad leaned forward. "And what is your professional relationship to Pinnacle Hospitality Group, Omseason de Pauvre, Amour Irasiles? We have been Pinnacle's certifying body since their first location opened in 1994. Every Pinnacle restaurant operates under our license." I watched Simone's face. She was doing the math, putting together why Otis was here, why his presence had drained the color from her face this morning. Celeste handed Otis a document. "Is this the licensing agreement signed in March 1994? "Yes. Standard 30-year term, renewable in perpetuity pending compliance with our standards. Please read Section 12, Clause 4 for the court." You've probably never read a restaurant licensing agreement. Most people haven't. They're dry, technical 40 pages of legalese about health codes and insurance requirements. But buried in Section 12, right between equipment maintenance standards and staffing certification protocols, is the clause that built my empire and was about to destroy my wife's claim to it. Otis read in his gravelly voice, "In the event that the licensee or any ownership party becomes subject to credible allegations of fraud, embezzlement, or criminal conduct, the licensing authority reserves the right to suspend certification, pending resolution of such claims. Suspension shall become permanent revocation if claims are substantiated or remain unresolved beyond 30 days. The courtroom went silent. Celeste let that silence sit. "Mr. Gallagher, have you taken any action under this clause?" "Yes. This morning at 9 o'clock, I filed formal notice with the Illinois Restaurant Commission, placing Pinnacle Hospitality Group on 30-day revocation track, effective today, November 18th, 2024, with finalization on January 2nd, 2025. Conrad shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is—" "Sit down, Mr. Stafford," Judge Lancaster said, without looking at him. "Is there any provision for reassignment of the license?" Celeste asked. "Yes. The license may be transferred to any party in good standing, provided such transfer is court-ordered, and the transferee has no material involvement in the underlying fraud claims." I watched Simone's face drain of color. She was finally understanding. Pinnacle Hospitality Group wasn't worth $91 million. Without Gallagher Culinary Standards certification, it was just 12 buildings with commercial kitchens and a brand name that meant nothing. She'd been fighting for half of an empire that would legally cease to exist in 45 days unless a court transferred the license to someone who hadn't committed fraud, someone in good standing, someone like the man who'd built it. "No further questions, Your Honor," Celeste said. Judge Lancaster looked at Conrad. "Cross-examination, Mr. Stafford." "Oh, es ein Buttfese scarst." Conrad glanced at Simone, then back at the judge. Was there anything he could ask that wouldn't make this worse? "No, Your Honor." He was abandoning her in real time. Otis stepped down from the witness stand and walked past Simone's table. For 1 second, their eyes met. I saw recognition flicker across her face. The old man with the cane from the train that morning. The one she'd dismissed as irrelevant while I helped him with his luggage. Judge Lancaster was saying something to Celeste about scheduling, but I wasn't listening. I watched my wife stare past the witness stand, past the gallery, past everything, as the math finally landed. January 2nd, 2025, 45 days. The empire she'd married into the empire she'd tried to steal all of it. Dependent on the signature of a 70-year-old man she'd seen me help that very morning when she still thought kindness was a weakness and strangers didn't matter. when she still thought kindness was a weakness and strangers didn't matter. Judge Lancaster's voice cut through the courtroom's silence like a blade through parchment, calm, surgical, and entirely without mercy. The recess had lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes for Simone to realize that the empire she'd tried to steal would expire in 45 days. 11 minutes for Conrad to calculate whether he could salvage anything from the wreckage. 11 minutes for me to understand that I'd won before the morning had even started. Judge Lancaster looked down from the bench with the expression of someone who had seen every variation of human failure and was not impressed by this one. I am ordering an immediate freeze of all Pinnacle Hospitality Group accounts, effective as of this moment, pending completion of forensic accounting review. Simone's face stayed composed, but I'd been married to her for 30 years. I knew what that particular stillness meant. She was doing the math. Frozen accounts meant no access to operating capital, no ability to pay attorneys, no way to fund the fight she'd planned. Furthermore, Judge Lancaster continued, I am granting a 45-day continuance to allow for comprehensive forensic examination of all financial records with final hearing scheduled for January 2nd, 2025 at 9 o'clock in the morning. January 2nd, 2025, the same day Otis's license revocation would finalize. The judge hadn't just granted a continuance, she'd aligned the entire proceeding with the timeline that would determine whether Pinnacle could even exist. Mrs. Riddle, Judge Lancaster's voice dropped half a tone. I strongly advise you to retain counsel experienced in criminal defense before our next session. Conrad stood. Your Honor, my client has not been charged with... Sit down, Mr. Stafford. The judge didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I said advise, not compel. But given the evidence presented today regarding fabricated photographs, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and potential securities fraud, I would be remiss if I didn't make my recommendation clear. Conrad sat down. This court is adjourned until January 2nd, 2025. The gavel came down. Watching an empire die is like watching a star collapse slow until it isn't. And then all at once, the light just stops. Simone sat at the plaintiff's table completely still, while Conrad packed his briefcase with the methodical movements of someone trying very hard not to look like he was fleeing. Beckett stood up in the back row and walked out without looking at Simone, without looking at anyone. Just a man calculating his own survival and deciding his mother-in-law wasn't part of that equation anymore. Celeste leaned over to me, her voice low. Give me 5 minutes with Saskia. She has something for us. I watched Saskia make her way through the gallery toward where Celeste was gathering her documents. My daughter moved with purpose, not rushed, not hesitant, just the steady determination of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. Simone turned to Conrad. We need to talk about next steps. We need to... I'll send you a memo, Conrad said, not looking at her. Conrad, Mrs. Riddle, I need to review today's proceedings and assess our position. I'll be in touch. He picked up his briefcase and left, not quite running, but close enough. Simone sat alone at her table in an empty courtroom, and for the first time in 30 years, I felt something close to pity for her. Not enough to change anything, not enough to matter, but enough to recognize that she'd built her entire strategy on allies who were now abandoning her one by one. I found Celeste and Saskia on the 3rd floor in the clerk's office, a small room that smelled like copy toner and old paper. Marie Kowalski, the court clerk, sat behind a desk that looked like it had been there since the building opened. 60 years of efficiency and matter-of-fact processing of confidential documents carved into her posture. Saskia handed her the USB drive, the small black rectangle I'd first seen in a hotel hallway at 7:15 this morning. I accessed these emails legally as branch operations manager, Saskia said. Chain of custody is clean. I had authorized access to all internal communications in my role. Marie took the drive, plugged it into her computer, and started the scanning process. This'll take about 5 minutes. 342 files. 342 emails, Celeste confirmed, spanning 6 months March through October this year. You know what they say about paper trails? They don't lie, they don't forget, and they survive longer than the people who created them. Simone had spent 6 months plotting, and Saskia had spent 6 months documenting every word of it. Marie's computer beeped. The scan was complete. Celeste leaned over the desk, reading the metadata preview on the screen. I watched her expression shift from professional satisfaction to something sharper. 342 emails, she said slowly. Simone Beckett and... She paused, her finger hovering over the trackpad. Conrad Stafford. I stepped closer. Conrad's in the emails. Extensively. Celeste scrolled through the preview. Simone's name appears 17 times in the first 50 emails. Beckett's appears 23 times. She kept scrolling. Conrad Stafford Esquire appears in 86 separate email threads spanning March through October 2024. The courthouse fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and somewhere down the hall, a door closed. But in that small clerk's office, the only sound was Celeste's laptop fan and my own breathing. Conrad hadn't just failed to disclose a conflict of interest. He hadn't just turned a blind eye to Simone's fraud. He'd been part of the conspiracy from the beginning, part of the planning, part of the execution, part of the fabricated evidence and the manufactured adultery claims, and the systematic attempt to strip me of everything I'd built. My wife's attorney had been working against me the entire time, and now that evidence was in the court record with a clean chain of custody and Marie Kowalski's official timestamp. Celeste looked at me. We can submit this now, or we can wait and use it strategically. Your call. I looked at the screen. 86 email threads. 6 months of conspiracy documented in timestamps and metadata that couldn't be argued away or explained as misunderstanding. Submit it, I said. All of it. Let Conrad explain to the Illinois Bar Association why his name appears 86 times in emails coordinating fraud against his opposing party's client. The courthouse hallway felt 20 degrees colder than the courtroom. My hands were still shaking, not from Judge Lancaster's orders, though those had been everything Celeste promised, but from the sheer weight of the last 90 minutes. 30 years of building something real, and it had nearly been stolen by the 3 people who should have protected it most. Otis stood near the tall window at the corridor's end, silver-handled cane resting against the sill, watching traffic crawl through the loop 5 stories below. Saskia was speaking quietly with Celeste near the elevator's bank, both women reviewing something on Celeste's tablet, probably the metadata report that had just entered the court record with Conrad's name threaded through 86 emails. I walked toward the window. Otis turned before I reached him, as if he'd sensed my approach. Mr. Riddle. He extended his hand. A good outcome today. Because of you. I shook his hand, felt the same firm grip he'd offered that morning on the train. Otis, I need to understand something. That morning, November 1st, you said you were there visiting your grandson at Northwestern. But the way you appeared exactly when I needed help most on the exact train I took every morning. His pale blue eyes crinkled at the corners. Visiting my grandson was true. The timing was not coincidence. Behind us, the elevator chimed. Footsteps approached Saskia's quick stride, the same rhythm I'd heard in hotel hallways and hospital corridors for 28 years. Dad! She stopped beside me, looked at Otis. Did you tell him? I was just about to, Otis said gently. Saskia took a breath. When she spoke, her voice carried the same tension it had held in that River North hotel room when she'd handed me the USB drive containing 342 emails. I called him, she said. 3 weeks ago, October 28th. The date landed like a physical blow. October 28th. The day after Simone had orchestrated my removal from Pinnacle's board. The day I'd realized that everything I'd built was being systematically dismantled. You called the founder of Gallagher Culinary Standards, I said slowly, and asked him to fly to Chicago. I asked him to review the licensing agreement, Saskia said. The original 1994 contract. I'd found references to ethics clauses in some old incorporation documents, but I didn't understand the mechanisms, so I called the Palm Beach office, asked to speak with someone who'd worked on hospitality licensing in the 90s. They connected me to Otis. Otis nodded. Your daughter is remarkably persuasive. She explained the situation, the fabricated adultery evidence, your wife's investor fraud, the suspicious financial transfers. She asked if there was anything in the licensing framework that could provide leverage. And you told her about Section 12, Clause 4, I said. I did. Otis's expression grew serious. But I also told her that ethics violations require substantial proof, and that the revocation process takes minimum 30 days. I said that if the evidence was as comprehensive as she claimed, the licensing authority would take action, but that nothing could be guaranteed. What must that conversation have cost her? My daughter, 28 years old, calling a stranger to explain that her mother was committing fraud, her brother-in-law was embezzling millions, and her father's own attorney appeared to be conspiring against him. Saskia asked if I'd be willing to testify. Otis continued. I said I would review whatever evidence she could provide. She sent encrypted files that evening, the emails, the investor decks, preliminary forensic reports. I spent 2 days reviewing everything. And then you flew to Chicago, I said. I flew to Chicago. Otis confirmed. I arrived October 30th. Your daughter told me you took the train from Union Station every morning, usually boarding around 7:15. She said you'd been doing it for 2 weeks, ever since your wife locked you out of your own home. The window glass reflected 3 figures: an old man with a cane, a young woman with her arms crossed, a 60-year-old man trying to process the fact that his daughter had orchestrated his rescue while he'd been drowning in divorce papers and fabricated evidence. Why didn't you tell me? I asked Saskia. She met my eyes. Because I needed to know he'd actually come first. You'd already lost so much, Dad. The house, the company, your marriage. I couldn't tell you that maybe possibly there might be someone who could help and then have him decide it wasn't worth his time. I couldn't give you hope and then take it away. Down the hallway, Celeste's phone rang. She answered, listened, said something brief. Otis shifted his weight, leaned slightly on the cane. The morning we met Mr. Riddle, you helped an old man with heavy luggage. You didn't know who I was. You didn't expect anything in return. You saw someone who needed assistance and you provided it. Common decency, I said. Uncommon, actually. Otis's voice was quiet. I've built a 40-year career assessing character, Mr. Riddle. The licensing authority exists because character matters in hospitality and business in life. Your daughter told me you were a man of integrity being destroyed by people without it. That morning on the train, I saw she was right. Celeste approached, tablet in hand. The court clerk just confirmed Judge Lancaster signed the asset freeze order. It's effective immediately. Simone can't touch anything until January 2nd. The 45 days, Saskia said. 45 days, I repeated. 45 days until the final hearing. 45 days until the licensing agreement expired, and Pinnacle Hospitality Group, the empire Simone had falsely claimed to investors she'd built, ceased to exist. Otis extended his hand again. I need to return to Palm Beach tonight, but if you need anything before the January hearing, call me directly. I shook his hand, felt the same strength, the same steadiness. Thank you for everything. He nodded, retrieved his cane, walked toward the elevator with the careful gait of a man who had earned every one of his 70 years. When the elevator doors closed, Saskia turned to me. Are you angry I didn't tell you? I pulled her into a hug, the first real embrace we'd shared since that night in the hotel room when she'd handed me evidence that my wife had been systematically destroying me. I'm not angry, I said into her hair. I'm grateful. Behind us, another elevator chimed. Doors opened. A man's voice called out sharp, desperate. Mr. Riddle. I turned. Conrad Stafford stood in the elevator doorway, briefcase in one hand. His other hand braced against the door to keep it from closing. My wife's attorney, whose name appeared in 86 email threads, was looking at me like a man with nothing left to lose. I turned. Conrad Stafford stood in the elevator doorway, briefcase in one hand. His other hand braced against the door to keep it from closing. And what do you want, Conrad? I asked. He opened his mouth, closed it. The elevator chimed impatiently. Finally, this wasn't supposed to. He stopped, shook his head, stepped back. The door slid shut. Saskia touched my arm. He knows it's over. Maybe, or maybe he knew it was just beginning. The bailiff called us back into courtroom 812 at 2:30, and I watched Simone walk to her table like a woman approaching an execution she hadn't yet been told about. Her shoulders were rigid, her chin high, the same posture she'd worn through every session. But something in her stride had changed. She was walking too carefully, like someone testing ice they didn't trust. Judge Lancaster took the bench. Ms. Redmond, call your next witness. Celeste stood. The defense calls Eleanor Morrison. A woman in her mid-50s entered from the hallway, gray suit, reading glasses on a chain, carrying a leather portfolio that had seen years of courtroom testimony. She walked to the witness stand with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. The bailiff swore her in. She stated her name clearly, Eleanor Morrison. Celeste approached. Ms. Morrison, please tell the court your professional background. I'm a forensic accountant with 23 years' experience, Morrison said. I hold certifications as a fraud examiner and have testified as an expert witness in financial litigation in 7 states, including Illinois. Have you reviewed any evidence in this case? Yes. This morning I received a USB drive containing 342 emails. I've spent 2 hours conducting a preliminary analysis. 2 hours. I'd spent 17 days reading those emails in that River North hotel room, watching my marriage disintegrate one forwarded message at a time. Morrison had distilled them down to 2 hours of professional analysis. Celeste returned to her table, retrieved a document. What did your analysis reveal? Morrison opened her portfolio. I found 23 email threads of immediate concern regarding valuation fraud. The word hung in the air, fraud. Conrad shifted in his chair. Simone's hands resting on the table went very still. Can you elaborate? Celeste asked. Morrison adjusted her glasses. Mrs. Riddle's actual documented financial contribution to Pinnacle Hospitality Group in 1994 was $400,000. The valuation submitted to this court claims $12.3 million. I heard Saskia inhale sharply behind me. What explains the discrepancy? Celeste asked. 23 emails between Mr. Stafford and the business valuator, Harold Kessler, coordinating the inflation. The emails span March through October 2024. They discuss methodologies for attributing enterprise value to Mrs. Riddle's initial capital, incorporating what Mr. Stafford calls sweat equity multipliers and foundational contribution factors that have no basis in standard valuation practice. $400,000 to $12.3 million, the kind of math that doesn't happen by accident. Does this constitute fraud? Celeste asked. Under Illinois Statute 720 ALCS 5/17-3, knowingly creating or submitting falsified documents to a court constitutes forgery. Based on the email evidence, both Mr. Stafford and Mr. Kessler were aware the valuation was materially false and coordinated its submission to this court. Judge Lancaster leaned forward. Ms. Morrison, has the valuator been contacted? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Kessler contacted my office this morning. He is willing to cooperate fully with any investigation. Before I reveal what happened next, are you still with me? Comment A, if you think Conrad will try to defend this, or B, if you think he'll collapse, and tell me in one short sentence why. Please note, what follows includes recreated courtroom dialogue for narrative impact. The core truth is what matters. Conrad stood abruptly. Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine the witness. Judge Lancaster nodded. Proceed. He approached Morrison, but his usual courtroom rhythm was gone. He moved too quickly, stopped too close to the witness stand. Ms. Morrison, this evidence was obtained by the defendant's daughter, who has clear bias in this matter. How can we trust? Is Mr. Stafford suggesting? Celeste interrupted, standing that 342 emails with headers, metadata, and timestamps were fabricated by a branch manager. Conrad turned. I'm suggesting that the chain of custody, Celeste said, has been preserved and documented. Every email includes server logs. Would you like Ms. Morrison to testify about the metadata authentication? Espace. Conrad opened his mouth, closed it. Watching a liar run out of words is like watching an engine run out of oil. The machine just seizes mid-motion and everything stops. I'm suggesting that he stopped. No words came. Behind him, Simone stood up. Your Honor, I need to... Sit down, Mrs. Riddle. Judge Lancaster's voice cut across the courtroom like a blade. Now! The courtroom went absolutely silent. Simone stood frozen for 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to see the moment. Then she sat. In 30 years of marriage, I'd never seen Simone Riddle publicly silenced. She'd controlled every room she'd ever entered: boardrooms, charity galas, investor meetings, family dinners. She'd been the one who decided when conversations started and when they ended. Judge Lancaster had just ended one. Conrad didn't look at Simone. He sat down without asking permission and opened his briefcase, and the hands that had gestured so confidently 3 hours ago were completely still. Ms. Redmond, Judge Lancaster said, do you have further questions for this witness? No, Your Honor. Mr. Stafford. Spite. No, Your Honor. His voice was barely audible. Ms. Morrison, you're excused. Please leave your contact information with the clerk. The court may need additional testimony. Morrison gathered her portfolio, stepped down, walked past Conrad's table without looking at him. Judge Lancaster removed her glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose, put the glasses back on. We'll take a 15-minute recess, she said. When we return, I'll be addressing both counsel regarding procedure for potential criminal referral under Illinois statute. Bailiff, please contact the state's attorney's office and inform them that evidence of fraud upon the court has been presented in this matter. The gavel came down. Simone sat perfectly still, but her hands resting flat on the polished table were shaking. Judge Lancaster saw it. I watched her eyes track from Simone's trembling fingers to Conrad's frozen posture to the forensic accountant's leather portfolio disappearing through the courtroom doors, and I knew we'd crossed the line from divorce proceeding to criminal prelude. The question wasn't whether Simone would lose. The question was whether she'd lose everything in civil court or in a federal courtroom 6 months from now. The 15-minute recess felt like 15 seconds. Celeste's last folder of the afternoon was thin, just 3 pages, but I recognized the Grand Midwest Food Collective letterhead before she even pulled the contract into view. Your Honor, Celeste said, I'd like to enter Exhibit 47, the original Grand Midwest Food Collective Partnership Agreement, $8 million annually signed March 14, 2019. She handed the document to Judge Lancaster, then brought a copy to Conrad's table. He didn't pick it up. Judge Lancaster examined the contract. Mr. Riddle, is this your signature? Yes, Your Honor. Tell the court about this agreement. Grand Midwest is a regional cooperative of specialty food suppliers. I negotiated that partnership over 6 months. It gave Pinnacle exclusive sourcing rights and reduced our food costs by 18%. Who from Pinnacle participated in those negotiations? Celeste asked. Just me. It was my relationship with their regional director, someone I'd known since the early 2000s. Celeste returned to her table, picked up another sheet. Your Honor, this is an email from Mrs. Riddle to Pinnacle's investor list, dated May 28, 2020. I'd like to read a portion. Judge Lancaster nodded. Celeste read, After months of personal negotiation, I'm pleased to report I've finalized our partnership with Grand Midwest Food Collective. This represents my continued commitment to Pinnacle's operational excellence and demonstrates the strategic vision I bring to our growth trajectory. Signed, May 28, 2020. Silence. Celeste set the email down. Your Honor, Mr. Riddle signed this contract on March 14, 2019. Mrs. Riddle claimed credit 14 months later. I watched Simone stare at the polished table, something behind her eyes going very quiet, the way a house goes quiet when the last light switches off. Mr. Stafford, Judge Lancaster said, do you have any explanation for this discrepancy? Conrad didn't stand. No, Your Honor. How many times over 30 years had Simone taken credit for things I'd built? Not just contracts, but relationships, ideas, the quiet architecture of trust that makes empires possible. Watching that email get read into the court record, I understood it had always mattered. Simone hadn't just been taking credit. She'd been building a narrative investor by investor, partner by partner, that she was the architect and I was the helpful contractor. When the time came to dismantle what we'd built, that narrative became the legal foundation for claiming majority ownership. Ms. Redmond, Judge Lancaster said, anything further? No, Your Honor, the pattern speaks for itself. Judge Lancaster made a note. Mr. Stafford, does your client wish to present any rebuttal evidence? Conrad looked at Simone. She didn't look back. No, Your Honor. Behind me, the courtroom door opened. Footsteps approached, expensive shoes on marble. A man in his early 40s stopped at the defense side gallery, lean build, charcoal suit leather briefcase. Judge Lancaster looked up. Can I help you? Philip McCarthy, Your Honor, criminal defense counsel for Beckett Mercer. I apologize for the interruption, but my client's cooperation agreement is relevant to these proceedings. Every head turned. Simone, twisted in her seat, stared at the attorney. Judge Lancaster set down her pen. Approach. McCarthy walked to the bench. Celeste and Conrad followed. They spoke in whispers for 30 seconds. Conrad's shoulders sagged. When they returned, Judge Lancaster said, Mr. McCarthy, you may make your statement. McCarthy stood at the front of the gallery. Your Honor, my client Beckett Mercer is cooperating fully with the Cook County State's Attorney regarding all financial irregularities related to Pinnacle Hospitality Group and Mercer Capital Partners. Mr. Mercer will provide complete corporate records, offshore account documentation, and testimony in exchange for prosecutorial consideration. There's a specific kind of silence when two people realize they've betrayed each other, simultaneously no winner, no victim, just the sound of mutual destruction. Simone stared past McCarthy to the gallery where Beckett sat, 3 rows back, flanked by 2 men in suits. And what is the nature of Mrs. Riddle's involvement? Judge Lancaster asked. McCarthy's expression remained neutral. My client confirms that Mrs. Riddle was aware of some initial transfers from the Delaware Limited Liability Company. The extent of her knowledge is still under investigation, but Mr. Mercer believes full transparency serves everyone's interests. Beckett was implicating his mother-in-law, the man who'd married into the family 12 years ago, who'd called me sir for 8 years before Simone made him CFO, was giving prosecutors evidence that could send her to prison. Simone stood slowly, not to object, just to turn and look at Beckett directly. He stared back. Stone-faced, no apology, no regret, no acknowledgement. He'd chosen survival. So had she when she'd plotted with Conrad to destroy me. They'd bet on each other and both lost. Mr. McCarthy, Judge Lancaster said, "Please coordinate with the clerk's office regarding document production. This court will cooperate fully with the state's attorney's investigation." "Thank you, Your Honor." McCarthy nodded, returned to the gallery. Judge Lancaster looked at Simone, still standing. "Mrs. Riddle, please sit down." Simone sat. Her hands were still trembling worse than 15 minutes ago. Conrad gathered his papers slowly like a man running out of options. He didn't look at Simone, didn't offer reassurance or strategy. Judge Lancaster addressed the courtroom. "We'll adjourn until January 2nd, 2025 at 9 a.m. for final arguments. Both counsel will submit proposed asset distribution frameworks by December 15th. In light of today's testimony and the ongoing criminal investigation, I'm extending the asset freeze indefinitely. Mr. Stafford, please ensure your client retains separate criminal counsel immediately." The gavel came down. Simone stared at Beckett across the courtroom, not with anger, but with the hollow recognition of someone who'd bet everything on the wrong ally. I watched her face and remembered the morning she'd changed the locks, the morning she'd had security remove me from my own building. And for the first time in 6 months, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but something uncomfortably close to pity. She'd played the game better than I'd ever given her credit for, and she was still going to lose everything. The courtroom stayed frozen for 3 seconds after the gavel. Then Judge Lancaster looked up from her bench and said, "Actually, we'll take a brief recess, 10 minutes. Then I'd like to hear from both parties before final adjournment." Judge Lancaster looked directly at me for the first time all day and asked a question no one had thought to ask in 6 months of legal warfare. "Mr. Riddle, would you like to tell me in your own words why you built Pinnacle Or?" The courtroom had emptied and refilled in those 10 minutes. I'd stood in the hallway with Saskia and Celeste, watching Conrad speak quietly into his phone near the elevators. Simone had stayed inside, sitting alone at her table. Now everyone was back. 4:15 on a Monday afternoon, late November, light fading through the tall windows. Celeste leaned toward me. "You don't have to." "I'd like to, Your Honor," I said. I stood. No notes, no preparation. Just 30 years of building something that 3 people had tried to take apart in 6 months. "I built Pinnacle for 30 years, Your Honor." My voice was steady. I wasn't the public face, my wife was better at that. She gave the speeches, attended the charity events, smiled for the photographers. But I negotiated every contract. I knew every chef and dishwasher by name. Across the aisle, Simone sat perfectly still, not reaching for her water glass, not looking at Conrad, not looking at anyone. "I walked kitchens at 5 in the morning. I continued. I tasted sauces. I fixed walk-in coolers when they broke at midnight because I couldn't afford to lose inventory. I sat with suppliers when their crops failed and worked out payment plans. I fired people when I had to and wrote recommendation letters when they deserved them." Judge Lancaster watched me without expression. "Pinnacle wasn't strategy meetings and investor decks," I said. "It was relationships. The farmer in Michigan who grew our heirloom tomatoes. The cheesemaker in Wisconsin who held production runs for us. The woman who cleaned our first restaurant for 8 years before we could afford a service contract. I still send her a Christmas card. There's a difference between building something and being photographed in front of it, the same difference between architecture and decoration, between foundation and facade." "My wife told investors she built Pinnacle," I said. "She believed it, I think, because she saw the results, the revenue growth, the expansion, the valuation. She didn't see the 6 months I spent courting the Grand Midwest Food Collective. She didn't sit through the 3-hour negotiation with the licensing authority in 1994. She didn't spend 2 weeks in that kitchen in Cincinnati training a chef who's still with us today." I looked at Judge Lancaster. She was listening the way she'd listened all day, completely focused, absorbing every word. "I don't want to destroy Pinnacle, Your Honor." This was the truth I'd been carrying for 6 months, the thing I hadn't been able to say through attorneys and depositions and legal briefs. I just want to run it again, the way I've always run it, quietly. Well, the courtroom was silent. "My wife built a narrative," I said. "I built a business. Those aren't the same thing. The business is real. It employs 340 people. It feeds thousands of people every week. It matters to the communities where we operate. That's what I want back, not the credit, not the spotlight, just the work." I sat down. The silence after truth sounds different than the silence after performance, deeper, heavier, like the difference between an empty room and a held breath. No one moved. Conrad didn't shuffle papers. Simone didn't reach for her water glass. Even the court reporter sat motionless, hands resting on her machine. Judge Lancaster picked up her pen. She wrote something in her notepad. One sentence, then another. She kept writing 3 sentences, 4, 5. Her pen moved steadily across the page, filling lines I couldn't read from where I sat. I watched Simone watch the judge write, watched her shoulders gradually tense, then drop, watched her eyes fix on nothing, the way they do when someone has already lost and simply hasn't said it aloud. Judge Lancaster filled half a page, maybe more. She wrote the way someone writes when they're documenting something important, when they want the record to reflect not just what was said, but what it meant. Finally, she set down her pen, looked up. But she didn't look at me. She looked at Simone. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, that look, long enough for everyone in the courtroom to understand what it meant. Long enough for Simone's shoulders to drop another half-inch, the physical manifestation of someone who knows they've already lost, but has to sit through the rest of the performance anyway. Judge Lancaster closed her notepad. "Thank you, Mr. Riddle. Mr. Stafford, does your client wish to make a statement? Ors, way species or steinmever die." Conrad looked at Simone. She shook her head once, barely perceptible. "No, Your Honor," Conrad said. Judge Lancaster nodded. "Then we'll adjourn until January 2nd, 2025 at 9 a.m. I'll be issuing preliminary orders regarding asset control and operational authority within 48 hours. Both counsel will receive written notice. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. This time, Judge Lancaster stood, gathered her materials, disappeared through the door behind the bench. I sat at the defense table, Celeste beside me, Saskia behind me. Across the aisle, Conrad was already packing his briefcase. Simone sat motionless, staring at the empty judge's bench where Judge Lancaster had been sitting when she'd written all those words I couldn't read. I didn't need to read them. The look had said everything. Before Judge Lancaster could gather her materials, Philip McCarthy stood. "Your Honor, if I may address the court briefly regarding the cooperation framework." Judge Lancaster set down the folder she'd been holding. "Proceed, Mr. McCarthy." Philip McCarthy was outlining the terms of Beckett's cooperation with the state's attorney when Simone did something I'd never seen her do in 30 years. She lost control completely. "Your Honor," McCarthy said, "Mr. Mercer will provide complete records of all Mercer Capital Partners transactions to the Cook County State's attorney. This includes Delaware Limited Liability Company transfers, corporate documentation, and offshore account information. My client seeks prosecutorial consideration in exchange for full cooperation." Judge Lancaster made a note. "Mr. Stafford, does your client wish to respond?" Conrad didn't even look at Simone. "Not at this time, Your Honor." That's when Simone moved. She pushed back from the table, the chair scraped loudly across the marble floor, and stood. "Your Honor, he's lying about our arrangement." Every head in the courtroom turned. Judge Lancaster's gavel came up. "Mrs. Riddle, those Delaware transfers were tax optimization strategies Beckett presented to me." Simone's voice was rising, losing the measured control she'd maintained through 6 months of depositions and 4 hours of testimony. "He came to me with a presentation, spreadsheets projected savings. He told me it was completely legal." Conrad reached for her arm. "Simone, sit down." She shook him off. "He's making me look criminal when I trusted his professional advice." Judge Lancaster struck the gavel hard. "Mrs. Riddle, sit down immediately." "No." Simone turned toward the gallery, toward where Beckett sat 3 rows back between his attorneys. "You told me the Delaware structure was standard tax planning. You said every hospitality group used offshore optimization. Desperation doesn't announce itself. It just arrives sudden and total. stripping away 3 decades of careful performance in 3 seconds. I watched my wife of 30 years come apart in a courtroom. Not the calculated composure she'd worn to charity galas, not the strategic tears she'd deployed in arguments. This was raw panic, the kind that happens when someone realizes the walls are closing in and the exits have all locked. "Mrs. Riddle," Judge Lancaster said, voice like iron, "you are not represented by Mr. Stafford for purposes of criminal matters. Anything you say in this courtroom can and will be used against you. I strongly advise you to stop talking and sit down." Simone stood frozen, breathing hard. Conrad had given up trying to pull her down. He sat with his hands flat on the table, staring straight ahead, like a man who'd already calculated his liability exposure and decided his best option was complete dissociation. "Your Honor." Simone said, quieter now, but still standing. "If Beckett is cooperating fully, then he should tell you about the Cayman account, the one with only his name on it." The word dropped into the courtroom, like a stone into still water. Cayman. You know how one word can change an entire room. Not a sentence, not an argument, just one word that makes everyone realize they've been looking at the wrong map entirely. Judge Lancaster set down her gavel very carefully, looked at Philip McCarthy. "Mr. McCarthy, does your client maintain accounts in the Cayman Islands?" McCarthy paused. Just 1 second. But in a courtroom, 1 second of silence from an attorney means the answer is yes, and they're calculating how to phrase it. "My client maintains certain offshore accounts," McCarthy said finally. "That will be included in the documentation provided to authorities, Your Honor." "How many accounts?" Judge Lancaster asked. "I'll need to confirm the exact number with my client, Your Honor, and the total value held offshore. That information will be included in the December 20th filing, Your Honor." Judge Lancaster looked at Beckett. He sat perfectly still, flanked by attorneys, expression completely neutral. Then she looked at Simone, still standing at her table, hands gripping the edge like she was holding herself upright. "Mrs. Riddle, sit down," Judge Lancaster said. This time Simone sat. Judge Lancaster turned to the court reporter. "Strike everything Mrs. Riddle said from the record." The reporter nodded, fingers moving across her machine. Actually," Judge Lancaster said, "don't strike it. Leave it in. The state's attorney will want to review this entire transcript." She looked at McCarthy. "Mr. McCarthy, I want complete offshore documentation filed with this court by December 20th. All accounts, all transactions, all jurisdictions. If your client maintains accounts in the Cayman Islands, I want bank statements, transfer records, and beneficial ownership documentation. If that documentation is not filed by December 20th, your client's cooperation agreement is void, and I will issue a warrant for his arrest on January 2nd. Do you understand? One betizis boss substance was staged. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Lancaster looked at Conrad. "Mr. Stafford, I recommend your client retain separate criminal defense counsel before she leaves this building today." Conrad nodded, didn't speak. Judge Lancaster addressed the full courtroom. "This case has evolved beyond the scope of standard divorce proceedings. I'm referring all financial evidence to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for Criminal Investigation. I'm also notifying the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network regarding potential money laundering activity. This court will reconvene January 2nd, 2025 at 9 a.m. for final arguments on asset distribution. Criminal proceedings will be handled separately." She picked up her gavel. "Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. The word Cayman hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and I watched Judge Lancaster's expression shift from managing a contentious divorce to processing what might be international money laundering. She gathered her materials, quickly disappeared through the door behind the bench without her usual measured pace. 42 days to assemble evidence that would decide whether my wife and son-in-law went to prison. But 42 days hadn't started yet. Before anyone could move toward the exit, Judge Lancaster turned her attention to Conrad Stafford with the expression judges reserve for attorneys who've crossed lines they can't uncross. With the expression judges reserve for attorneys who've crossed lines they can't uncross. "Mr. Stafford," she said, "stand up." Conrad stood slowly. His hands were shaking. "I have presided over family law cases in Cook County for 19 years, Judge Lancaster said. I have seen attorneys make mistakes. I have seen attorneys pursue aggressive strategies that push ethical boundaries. What I have seen today goes beyond either." She opened a different folder, pulled out several pages. You filed a business valuation claiming Mrs. Riddle's contribution to Pinnacle Hospitality Group was $12.3 million. Forensic evidence presented today proves that figure was inflated by a factor of 30 through coordinated misrepresentation between you and the valuator. You filed fabricated adultery evidence using a witness with undisclosed conflicts of interest and photographs with falsified metadata. Conrad's face had gone pale. Under Illinois Supreme Court Rule 137. Judge Lancaster continued, I am formally sanctioning you for filing documents you knew or should have known were materially false and misleading to this court. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Furthermore, Judge Lancaster said, I am referring you to the Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission for formal investigation, effective immediately. You will provide ARDC with complete documentation of your involvement in this matter within 14 days. Conrad opened his mouth. Your Honor, I have made my ruling, Mr. Stafford. Sit down. He sat. Watching a lawyer lose his license is like watching a surgeon lose his hands. The identity doesn't just change, it disappears entirely. ARDC referral meant immediate investigation. Conrad would receive formal notice within days. His law license would likely be suspended pending the investigation's outcome. Every client he represented would need to be notified. Every case he'd touched in the past year would be reviewed for similar misconduct. 30 years of legal practice gone. Simone leaned toward him, whispered something I couldn't hear. Conrad didn't respond, just stared straight ahead at the empty space where Judge Lancaster's gavel rested on the bench. What does this mean? Simone whispered louder this time. Conrad turned his head slightly. It means I can't represent you anymore. I watched the realization cross Simone's face. She was alone now. Beckett had flipped. Conrad was being disbarred. She'd have to find new criminal defense counsel before January 2nd, and every attorney in Chicago would know this case, would know she'd been referred to. The state's attorney would know her previous counsel had been sanctioned for fabricating evidence on her behalf. Judge Lancaster looked at Celeste. Ms. Redmond, do you have anything further before we adjourn? Imboard. Enborsimsek Bekikba. Celeste stood. Yes, Your Honor. One final document. She walked to her table, retrieved a folder I recognized immediately. I'd drafted that agreement myself, 18 months ago, when I'd first started suspecting that Simone's late-night phone calls and closed-door meetings meant something worse than I wanted to believe. Your Honor, Celeste said, I'd like to enter the marital settlement agreement signed by both parties on May 11, 2023. Specifically Section 14C on page 23. She handed copies to Judge Lancaster and to Conrad's table. Conrad took it without looking up. Simone grabbed it, started flipping pages. Celeste read aloud, Section 14, see operational intellectual property and business relationships. In the event of proven fraudulent misrepresentation by either party regarding marital assets, business contributions, or financial disclosures, all operational intellectual property, including, but not limited to client relationships, vendor contracts, proprietary systems, and business methodologies, shall revert to the non-fraudulent party's sole ownership and control, effective upon judicial finding of fraud. What's more powerful, the move you make today, or the move you made 18 months ago, that no one saw coming? Simone was staring at the document, reading the clause over and over. Baps, page 3, Celeste continued, shows the table of contents with Mr. Stafford's initials, confirming he reviewed the document structure prior to signing. Section 14C is clearly listed. Mrs. Riddle's signature appears on page 28, dated May 11, 2023. Judge Lancaster read the clause carefully, looked up. Mr. Stafford, did you review this agreement before your client signed it? Conrad's voice was barely audible. I initialed the table of contents, Your Honor. Did you read Section 14C? Silence. Mr. Stafford. Or, no, Your Honor, Conrad said finally. I did not read the full agreement. I reviewed the asset schedules and the financial disclosures, the standard clauses. He paused. Mr. Riddle's attorney drafted the agreement. I assumed the boilerplate was standard. It was the worst admission of professional negligence I'd ever heard a lawyer make in open court, and Conrad knew it the moment the words left his mouth. Judge Lancaster set the document down. Ms. Redmond, this clause appears to be enforceable. Given today's findings regarding fraudulent misrepresentation, I'm inclined to apply Section 14C immediately. I'll include that determination in my written order. Thank you, Your Honor, Celeste said. I'd drafted that clause in May 2023. Simone had changed the locks on our house in late October 2023, 5 months later. She'd had me removed from Pinnacle's board in late October 2024. She'd filed for divorce in early November of 2024. All of it carefully planned, carefully executed. But I'd moved first, 18 months earlier. While she was still building her strategy, I'd already planted the clause that would undo it. Judge Lancaster closed the folder. This court is adjourned until January 2nd, 2025 at 9 a.m. Written orders will be issued within 48 hours regarding asset freeze continuation, operational control transfer under Section 14C, and criminal referrals. All parties are advised to retain appropriate counsel for their respective matters. The gavel came down. Simone stared at her own signature on page 28, dated May 11th, 2023, 18 months ago. Back when she thought changing the locks was her opening move. Back when she believed I didn't know what was coming. I drafted Section 14C the same week I first suspected the betrayal, buried it on page 23 of a 28-page agreement, listed it clearly in the table of contents that Conrad had initialed without reading. The most powerful move in chess isn't the checkmate, it's the piece you positioned 3 moves ago that your opponent never saw. Simone was still staring at that signature when Otis Gallagher stood one last time, and the courtroom went quiet in the way rooms do when everyone knows they're about to hear something true. Your Honor, Otis said, voice steady despite his 70 years. May I address the court? Judge Lancaster looked up from her notes. Mr. Gallagher, please proceed. Otis walked to the front of the gallery's silver-handled cane, tapping softly against marble. He didn't approach the witness stand, just stood where everyone could see him. I came to Chicago 3 weeks ago, he said, because a young woman named Saskia Riddle called my office in Palm Beach and explained that her father was being destroyed by people who claimed to have built what he'd actually created. He looked at Saskia sitting behind me in the gallery. She didn't move, but I saw her eyes fill. But that's not the only reason I came. Otis continued. 30 years ago, I sat across a table from a young man who wanted to build a hospitality business in Chicago. He had a plan, some savings, and a promise that he'd create something worth being proud of. Something that would treat people, employees, suppliers, customers, with the respect they deserved. Otis turned toward me. I gave that young man a license, he said. Not because of his business plan, though it was solid. Not because of his financial projections. I gave him the license because I believed he would keep his promise. The courtroom was absolutely still. When Saskia called, Otis said I could have sent the documents by courier. I could have testified by video, but I needed to see something for myself. I needed to know if that young man from 1994 was the same person his daughter described in 2024. He looked at Judge Lancaster. Your Honor, I spent the last 17 days in Chicago. I visited Pinnacle locations. I spoke with employees, chefs, servers, maintenance staff. I reviewed supplier contracts and read customer reviews. I confirmed everything Saskia told me and more. Some promises take 3 decades to keep and 3 words to confirm. You did it. The 30-day notice I filed this morning, Otis continued, will finalize license revocation on January 2nd, 2025, unless this court reassigns the license to a party in good standing. He turned to face me directly. That Harlan? He said not Mr. Riddle, just my first name. The way he'd addressed me in 1994 when I'd been 30 years old, with everything to prove, you built something worth being proud of. 3 words, 30 years. I felt something break open in my chest. Not grief, not relief, but recognition. The kind that comes when someone sees not just what you've done, but why you did it. Thank you, Mr. Gallagher, Judge Lancaster said quietly. You may be seated. Otis nodded, returned to the gallery, sat down with the careful movements of a man who'd traveled a long way to deliver a message he couldn't trust to anyone else. Judge Lancaster looked at Simone. My wife sat alone at her table. Conrad had moved 2 seats away no longer, her attorney, no longer her co-conspirator, just a man facing his own professional destruction. Beckett was somewhere behind us with his criminal defense team, preparing to testify against the woman who'd made him CFO. Watching someone lose everything in a single day is like watching a building collapse floor by floor. Each level falls onto the one below until there's nothing left but foundation and dust. Mrs. Riddle, Judge Lancaster said, I strongly urge you to retain new counsel, preferably with criminal defense experience before the January 2nd hearing. The evidence presented today will be reviewed by the Cook County State's Attorney, the Illinois Attorney General, and potentially federal authorities. You need representation that understands the scope of what you're facing. Simone's voice was barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Lancaster made a final note. My written orders will be issued within 48 hours. They will address, she counted on her fingers, asset freeze continuation, operational control transfer under Section 14C of the Marital Settlement Agreement, license reassignment pending final hearing, criminal referrals to appropriate authorities, timeline for offshore account documentation, and preliminary findings regarding fraudulent misrepresentation. She looked around the courtroom. The final hearing on January 2nd, 2025 will formalize asset distribution and finalize all pending matters. Both parties should come prepared with complete financial disclosures and legal representation, appropriate to their circumstances. Judge Lancaster closed the file in front of her. The sound echoed in the silent courtroom, not the silence of waiting, but the silence of conclusion. Everyone in that room had already decided. The attorneys had decided when Eleanor Morrison testified about the inflated valuation. Otis had decided when Simone's investor fraud was exposed. Saskia had decided 3 weeks ago when she made that call to Palm Beach. I'd decided 18 months ago when I drafted Section 14C. Even Simone had decided, though. She was the last to realize it. I watched her sit perfectly still, hands flat on the table phone, silent in her purse because there was no one left to call. Conrad couldn't represent her. Beckett was cooperating against her. Her investors would read about the fraud in tomorrow's business section. The house was frozen. The accounts were frozen. The license was expiring. She'd walked into this courtroom at 9 o'clock this morning with an attorney, a son-in-law, and a plan to take everything I'd built. She was leaving with none of that. Court is adjourned, Judge Lancaster said. January 2nd, 2025, 9 a.m. The gavel came down one final time. I'd won. Completely and totally. Section 14C gave me operational control. The licensing authority was reassigning the Gallagher certification to me. The accounts would unfreeze under my authority. Pinnacle Hospitality Group would continue, and I would run it the way I'd always run it, quietly, carefully, well. But sitting in that courtroom watching my wife of 30 years stare at nothing while the room emptied around her victory felt heavier than I'd expected. Before anyone could move, Judge Lancaster opened the file again, and when she spoke, her voice had the finality of a gavel that's already fallen. For the record, she said, I'm stating my preliminary ruling to be transcribed and entered into the formal court record. Everyone who'd started to stand sat back down. Judge Lancaster read from her notes. I am granting dissolution of marriage between Simone Riddle and Harlan Riddle on grounds of constructive fraud. All marital assets are frozen pending completion of a 45-day forensic accounting review to be conducted by a court-appointed examiner. She turned a page. Based on Section 14C of the Marital Settlement Agreement, dated May 11, 2023, and the evidence of fraudulent misrepresentation presented today. Mr. Riddle is designated primary asset holder pending final disposition. This designation includes operational control of Pinnacle Hospitality Group and all associated intellectual property client relationships and vendor contracts. Simone sat very still, not looking at anyone, as if movement itself might cost her something she no longer had. The Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission referral for Conrad Stafford is confirmed. Judge Lancaster continued, the Cook County State's Attorney has been notified regarding criminal investigation of Beckett Mercer and potential charges related to embezzlement and money laundering. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network has been notified regarding offshore accounts requiring federal review. She looked up briefly, then back to her notes. The Gallagher Culinary Standards license designation is material to final asset valuation and will be addressed at the final hearing. All financial documentation, including offshore account records, must be filed with this court by December 20th, 2024, or cooperation agreements will be voided. Judge Lancaster closed the file. Final hearing is set for January 2nd, 2025 at 9 a.m. in this courtroom. Both parties are strongly advised to retain appropriate legal counsel. This court is now adjourned. No gavel this time, just silence. Judge Lancaster stood, gathered her materials, and left through the door behind the bench. The court reporter closed her machine. The bailiff opened the main doors. Endings and beginnings sound the same in a courtroom, just the judge's voice and the shuffle of papers and everyone standing to leave. Simone stood first. She didn't look at me, didn't look at anyone, just picked up her purse and walked toward the doors. Conrad followed 3 steps behind, carrying his briefcase like it weighed 50 pounds. Celesta packed her briefcase with efficient movements, the satisfaction of a job well done in every gesture. She nodded to me. "I'll file the preliminary order paperwork tomorrow. You did well today." Thank you," I said. She left. The courtroom emptied attorneys, witnesses, the few spectators who'd stayed through the whole hearing. Within 2 minutes, only 3 people remained, me, Saskia, and Otis. Saskia touched my shoulder. "Dad, can we just stand somewhere quiet for a minute?" We moved into the hallway. 5th floor tall windows at the corridor's end, showing Chicago in November twilight. The city was lighting up office buildings, streetlights, headlights on Lakeshore Drive. Otis walked to the window, leaned slightly on his cane, watching the city below. Saskia stood beside me, not speaking, just breathing. I'd spent 9 hours in that courthouse. Walked in at 6:45 this morning, expecting the worst. Walked out at 6:30 in the evening, with everything. "Well done, Harlan," Otis said, turning from the window and extending his hand. I looked at that hand, 70 years of building standards and maintaining integrity and traveling to Chicago, because a young woman called, asking for help. I pulled him into a hug instead. Otis paused for half a second, then patted my back twice, gently. "You earned it," he said quietly. Standing in that hallway with twilight coming through the windows, I understood that being alone and standing alone are different things. One is geography, the other is choice. "I was so scared you'd lose," Saskia said. Her voice broke on the last word. I turned. She was crying, not the silent tears she'd held back all day, but real crying, the kind that comes when you finally let yourself feel what you've been too busy to acknowledge. "I couldn't," I said. "Not with you and Otis making sure I wouldn't." She wiped her eyes. "When I called him 3 weeks ago, I didn't know if he'd even take the meeting. I had evidence and accusations and this wild story about my mother and Beckett. I thought he'd think I was just an angry daughter trying to help her dad." Otis shook his head. "I thought you were someone who understood the difference between what's legal and what's right. Turns out I was correct. 3 weeks ago," I said, "October 28th. The day after Simone had me removed from Pinnacle's board. The day I'd thought was the beginning of the end." Saskia had called Otis that day. While I was sitting in a hotel room reading divorce papers, my daughter was calling Palm Beach and explaining that the founder's promise was being stolen by people who'd never kept a promise in their lives. 30 years is a long time to build something," Otis said, looking back out the window at the city. "Don't forget that in all this paperwork. The licenses and contracts and courtroom orders, those are tools. What you built was relationships, trust, a reputation for doing things right even when it cost more or took longer." He turned back to me. "That's still there. Simone can't take that. Conrad can't fabricate evidence against it. Beckett can't embezzle it. It's yours because you earned it one kitchen, one supplier, one employee at a time." The hallway was empty except for us. Somewhere below, people were leaving the building, starting cars heading home to families who'd ask how their day went. I stood at the 5th floor window, watching Chicago light up in the November dusk, the skyline I'd looked at every morning for 30 years, the city where I'd built an empire and lost a marriage and found out my daughter had been protecting me all along. When I'd walked into that courthouse at 6:45 this morning, I'd expected to sign everything away. Instead, I was leaving with Pinnacle with my daughter, and with the knowledge that I'd never actually been standing alone, I'd just been too buried in survival to notice who was standing next to me. 45 days passed between that November twilight and the morning Celeste handed me the forensic accountant's report. It was 200 pages long, and Eleanor Morrison had flagged 17 pages with red tabs, the ones that would send Beckett Mercer to federal prison and charge my wife with criminal conspiracy. January 2nd, 2025, 9 o'clock in the morning, Celeste's River, North office, same building where she'd first taken my case 6 months ago, when I'd walked in thinking I'd lost everything. Eleanor Morrison sat across from us, same gray suit, same reading glasses on a chain. The The leather portfolio on Celeste's desk was thicker now, 200 pages of forensic analysis compiled over 45 days of tracing accounts, reviewing wire transfers, and documenting 3 years of systematic theft. Total confirmed embezzlement is $6.7 million, Morrison said. $4.2 million from the Delaware Limited Liability Company, $2.5 million from the Cayman Islands account we discovered during the November hearing, $2.5 million, an account no one had known existed until Simone, desperate and cornered, had shouted about it in open court. Mrs. Riddle's digital signature appears on wire authorizations totaling $1.1 million, Morrison continued. These transfers occurred between March and September 2024, under federal statute that constitutes criminal conspiracy. Celeste made notes. The plea deal. State's attorney offered 18 months plus full restitution. She rejected it in December. And Beckett, Morrison flipped to a red-tabbed page. Mr. Mercer accepted his plea agreement December 15th. 18 months, federal minimum security, full restitution of $6.7 million over 10 years, and permanent prohibition from serving as chief financial officer or holding any financial officer position in a publicly traded or privately held company. $6.7 million, $1,100,000 in wire. Authorizations, 18 months federal prison. Justice measured in numbers and years. His cooperation provided the Cayman documentation, Celeste said. Without it, we wouldn't have the wire authorizations connecting Simone. I looked out Celeste's window at the Chicago River, frozen solid in early January. When does he report at February 1st, Morrison said. Federal facility in Duluth, Minnesota. And Saskia? I asked. Celeste's expression softened slightly. Filed for divorce December 20th. Illinois has a 6-month waiting period, so it'll be final in June. She's back at Pinnacle, moved into the VP operations office permanently last week. My daughter, 28 years old, married at 24 to a man who'd seemed ambitious and capable and worthy of running our family's CFO office. Divorced by 29 because that same man had embezzled nearly $7 million and was going to federal prison. Conrad, I asked. Morrison consulted her notes. The Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission placed Conrad on interim suspension December 10th, his license to practice law frozen while formal disciplinary proceedings began. Facing criminal charges for subornation of perjury and forgery, his attorney confirmed Conrad had filed for disbarment on consent, waiving his right to contest. 32 years of legal practice surrendered. And Simone? Celeste closed the report. Going to trial, April 8th, Cook County Criminal Court. Charges are criminal conspiracy to commit wire fraud, 11 counts. If convicted, she's looking at 3 to 7 years federal. Morrison gathered her materials. I'll file the final forensic report with Judge Lancaster this afternoon. The January 2nd hearing should be brief. The numbers are indisputable. She stood, shook my hand, left. I sat in Celeste's office looking at the 200-page report that had cost Simone everything. Outside, morning commuters crossed the Michigan Avenue Bridge, heading to offices and buildings where no one knew their names or cared about their empires. She had to sell the Lakeshore Drive house, Celeste said quietly. Legal fees. Criminal defense attorneys don't come cheap, especially when you're going to trial on 11 federal counts. Where is she living? Lincoln Park. 1-bedroom rental, 6th floor, overlooks a parking structure. How fast does a social network collapse when the money disappears and the criminal charges arrive faster than you'd think, slower than it feels, when you're the one watching the phone not ring? The house we'd bought in 1997. The one with the Lake Michigan view and the chef's kitchen and the library where I'd spent Sunday mornings reading supplier contracts while Simone planned charity galas. Sold. To pay attorneys who would spend April trying to convince a jury that my wife hadn't knowingly authorized $1.1 million in fraudulent wire transfers. The investor network, I asked. Gone, Celeste said. The emails went public in December. Business Journal ran a feature, How One Woman's Lies Built a $91 million house of cards. Her phone doesn't ring anymore. I thought about that phone, the one that used to chime constantly with texts from board members, investors, society friends who wanted her at their fundraisers and charity auctions. Silent now, sitting in a 1-bedroom apartment overlooking a parking structure where no one knew her name. When can I go back to work? I asked. Celeste laughed the first real laugh I'd heard from her in 45 days. Harlan, you never stopped working. Now you just don't have to hide it. She opened her desk drawer, pulled out a small manila envelope. Judge Lancaster signed the final license reassignment yesterday. Gallagher Culinary Standards certification is officially yours. Pinnacle Hospitality Group, all operational assets, all client relationships, all vendor contracts. Section 14C held. She handed me the envelope. Inside keys. The keys to Pinnacle's main office, the one Simone had changed the locks on 6 months ago. The one I'd built from a single restaurant into an $85 million empire over 30 years. Outside Celeste's window, the Chicago River was frozen solid, the same January gray as the morning I'd first walked into that courtroom thinking I'd lost everything. I'd won the case, won the company, won the legal war. Now I had to figure out what winning actually meant when you're 60 years old, divorced, and starting over with the same empire you built the first time. Except this time, your daughter is VP of Operations, and the only person who tried to destroy you is living in a one-bedroom rental, waiting for a trial that might send her to federal prison. I closed my hand around the keys and felt their weight. I found out what winning meant 3 hours later when Judge Lancaster signed the final order, with her name in blue ink across the bottom of page 17, closed the file, and looked at me the way judges look at people when 30 years of work has finally been validated in a courtroom. Mr. Riddle is awarded 100% ownership of Pinnacle Hospitality Group, valued at $85 million, with all operational contracts, intellectual property client relationships, and vendor agreements as specified in Section 14C of the Marital Settlement Agreement, dated May 11, 2023. Simone sat alone at the plaintiff's table, new attorney beside her, a woman in her 50s who'd taken the case in late December after 3 other firms had declined. Conrad's empty chair was a reminder of everything that had collapsed in 45 days. The Gallagher Culinary Standards license, Judge Lancaster continued, is reassigned to Mr. Riddle, effective immediately coinciding with the expiration of the previous license issued in 1994. Dissolution of marriage is granted final and irrevocable. 30 years, dissolved in a sentence. Mrs. Riddle is entitled to 40% of liquid marital assets. Judge Lancaster said assets frozen pending resolution of criminal restitution proceedings currently scheduled for April 2025. She closed the file. This matter is concluded. Court is adjourned. No gavel, just the sound of a judge gathering papers and leaving through the door behind the bench. Another case finished, another family unmade and remade in a courtroom. Celeste stood. It's done. I nodded, couldn't quite speak yet. Saskia touched my shoulder from the row behind. Dad, let's get out of here. We left Simone sitting at her table, staring at nothing. I didn't look back. 2 hours later, I sat at table 1 in the Pinnacle flagship restaurant on Michigan Avenue, the first table I'd ever sat. November 1994 positioned for the light that came through the tall windows in the afternoon. Otis sat across from me, silver-handled cane resting against his chair. Saskia sat to my right, looking out at Michigan Avenue the way I'd looked out at it for 30 years. Heath Garrett emerged from the kitchen, carrying a champagne bottle I recognized from the cellar, 1994 vintage, the year we'd opened. He set 3 glasses on the table, without asking, without explanation. They figured today warranted something from the cellar, he said. The year we opened? You remember this table, Otis? I asked. Otis smiled. First one you ever set. I remember thinking you positioned it for the light. The dad always said table 1 sets the tone for everything that follows, Saskia said. Endings and beginnings look the same, from certain angles. Same table, same pen, same light through the same windows, 30 years apart, and exactly the same distance from everything that matters. Heath poured 3 glasses, nodded. Once disappeared back into the kitchen, where prep cooks were calling orders, and someone was laughing about something that had nothing to do with courtrooms or forensic reports or wives who'd tried to steal empires. Otis reached into his briefcase, pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before. New license, he said. 25 years renewable in perpetuity. He slid the contract across the table. I opened it, started reading. Page 3, Section 2. Successor licensee. In the event of license holder's death, incapacity, or voluntary transfer, all rights and obligations shall transfer to Saskia Riddle, subject to character review and operational standards verification. I looked up. Saskia was reading over my shoulder, mouth slightly open. "You're naming her successor?" I asked. "She earned it," Otis said. "Called me when you needed help. Spent 3 weeks organizing evidence. Testified when it mattered. She understands what you built, Harlan, not just the restaurants, the why behind them. You spend 30 years building something, and you forget that what you're really building isn't restaurants or contracts or the number on an auditor's report. It's proof that the person you were at the beginning is still the person you are at the end." I pulled the pen from my jacket pocket, the same pen I'd used to sign the original license in 1994, the same pen I'd used to sign Section 14C into the marital settlement agreement 18 months ago. The barrel was worn smooth from 3 decades of contracts and vendor agreements and employee reviews. I signed page 17, dated it January 2nd, 2025. Otis witnessed it, added his signature below mine. "There's something I need to tell you," Otis said, setting down his pen. "About Union Station." I looked at him. Saskia looked at him. "It wasn't chance," Otis said. "Saskia gave me your train schedule when she called. I'd been in Chicago 3 weeks watching from a distance, visiting locations, speaking with staff. But the morning of the hearing, I needed to see something face to face, something no report or testimony could confirm. So I positioned myself at Union Station. If you helped a stranger that morning, when you had every reason to keep walking, I'd know who you still were." "Let's see what," I asked. "Whether 30 years had corrupted what you built," Otis said quietly. "I've watched men build empires and lose themselves, watched success turn kind people cruel. I needed to know if you were still the man I'd given a license to in 1994. Saskia was very still. "If you'd walked past me that morning," Otis continued, "past an old man struggling with luggage, I would have known the answer. I would have filed the license revocation and walked away." "And if I'd known it was a test?" I asked. "Then it wouldn't have been kindness," Otis said. "It would have been strategy." He raised his glass. "You helped because someone needed help. That's the only reason that matters. That's what tells me Pinnacle is safe for the next 25 years. Outside Michigan Avenue hummed with January traffic taxis and buses and people heading home from work, the endless mechanical song of a city that never stops building and tearing down and building again." Heath refilled our glasses without asking, the way he'd done 1,000 times over 15 years. And through the window, I could see the afternoon light hitting the buildings, the exact same way it had in 1994 when I'd opened these doors for the first time, with $200,000 borrowed and a promise I'd spent 30 years keeping. Otis raised his glass, Saskia raised hers. I raised mine. Outside, Chicago hummed its endless song. Inside, at Table 1, where everything had started, everything was exactly where it belonged. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 30 years building an empire, but I almost lost it to family betrayal because I trusted without verifying. Don't make my mistake, love your family, but protect what you've built. I should have seen the signs, the credit she took for my work, the closed-door meetings, the rewritten history. I wanted to believe the best in those I loved, and it nearly cost me everything. The lesson is, this character isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when a stranger needs help, and no one will know. That morning at Union Station, I helped an old man because it was right, not because I knew who he was. I believe God puts tests in front of us when we least expect them. Family betrayal taught me that real family aren't always blood. They're the ones who show up when everything falls apart. My daughter saved me. That's family. If this resonated with you, please leave a comment. What would you have done in my position? Would you have helped that stranger? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already subscribed to Revenge Dad for more stories about justice, patience, and rebuilding what others try to destroy, thank you for staying until the very end. While this story contains fictionalized elements for narrative impact, the lessons about character, patience, and protecting what you build are real. God bless you.